Chapter 11, Part 4 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue, Chapter 11, Part 4. Madame d'Harville hid her face in her hands. Overcome by this painful disclosure, she had not courage to add another word. Rodolphe also remained silent. His mind recoiled affrighted from the terrible mysteries of this night. He pictured to himself the young maiden, already sad, in consequence of her return to the city in which her mother had died, arriving at a strange house, alone with a man for whom she felt an interest and esteem, but not love, nor any of those sentiments which enchant the mind, none of the engrossing feeling which removes the chaste alarms of a woman in the participation of a lawful and reciprocal affection. No, no; on the contrary, Clémence arrived agitated and distressed, with depressed spirits and tearful eyes. She was, however, resolved on resignation and the fulfilment of duty, when, instead of listening to language full of devotion, love, and tenderness, which would compensate for the sorrowful feelings which were uppermost in her mind, she sees, convulsed at her feet, a stricken man who twists and foams and shrieks, in the hideous convulsions of one of the most fearful infirmities with which a man can be incurably smitten. This is not all. His child, poor little innocent angel, is also withered from her birth. These sad and painful avowals excited bitter reflections in Rodolph's mind. "Such," said he, "is the law of the land. A young, handsome, and pure girl, the confiding and gentle victim of a shameful dissimulation, unites her destiny to that of a man tainted with an incurable malady, a fatal inheritance which he will assuredly transmit to his children. The unhappy wife discovers this horrid mystery. What can she do? Nothing. Nothing but suffer and weep; nothing but endeavour to overcome her disgust and fright; nothing but pass her days in anguish, in indefinable and endless terror; nothing but seek, perhaps, culpable consolation without the desolate existence which has been created around her." "Again," said Rodolph, "these strange laws sometimes produce horrible unions, fearful for humanity. In these laws, animals always appear superior to man in the care bestowed upon them, in the improvements that are studied for them, in the protection which encircles, the guarantees which attend them. Buy an animal, and, if an infirmity decried by the law is detected after the purchase, the sale is null and void. Indeed, what a shame, what a case of public injury would it be to compel a man to keep an animal which has a cough, is lame, or has lost an eye! Why, it would be scandalous, criminal, unheard of infamy! Only imagine being compelled to keep, and keep for ever, a mule with a cough, a horse that was blind, or an ass that was lame! What frightful consequences might not such injustice entail on the community! Therefore, no such bargains hold good, no words bind, no contract is valid. The omnipotent law unlooses all that was bound. But if it relates to a creature made after God's own image, if it respects a young girl who, in the full and innocent reliance on the good faith of a man, unites her lot with his, and wakes up in the company of an epileptic, an unhappy wretch stricken with a fearful malady, whose moral and physical consequences are immeasurably distressing, a malady which may throw disorder and aversion into a family, perpetuate a horrible disease, vitiate whole generations, yes, this law, so inexorable when lame, blind, or coughing animals are the consideration, this law, so singularly clear-sighted, which will not allow an unsound horse to increase the species, this law will not loosen the victim of a union such as we have described. These bonds are sacred, indissoluble. It is to offend God and man to break them. In truth," continued Rodolph, "men sometimes display a humility most shameful, and an egotistical pride which is only execrable. He values himself at less than the beast which he protects by warranties which he refuses for himself; and he imposes on himself, makes sacred, and perpetuates his most distressing infirmities by putting them under the protection of the immutability of laws, human and divine." Rodolph greatly blamed M. d'Harville, but he promised to himself to excuse him in the eyes of Clémence, although fully persuaded, after her sad disclosure, that the marquis was for ever alienated from her heart. One thought led to another, and Rodolph said to himself, I have kept aloof from a woman I love, and who, perhaps, already feels a secret inclination for me. Either from an attachment of heart or friendship, she has bestowed her honour, her life, for the sake of a fool whom she thought unhappy. If, instead of leaving her, I had paid her all sorts of attentions, love, and consideration, my name would have been such that her reputation would not have received the slightest stain, the suspicions of her husband would never have been excited; whilst now she is all but at the mercy of such an ass as M. Charles Robert, who, I fear, will become the more indiscreet in proportion as he has the less right to be so. And then, too, who knows if, in spite of the dangers she has risked, the heart of Madame d'Harville will always remain free? Any return to her husband is henceforward impossible. Young, handsome, courted, with a disposition sympathising with all who suffer, what dangers, what shoals and quicksands lie before her! For M. d'Harville, what anguish and what deep chagrin! At the same time jealous of and in love with his wife, who cannot subdue the disgust and fright which he excited in her on their nuptials, what a lot is his! Clémence, with her forehead hidden by her hands, her eyes brimful of tears, and her cheek reddened by embarrassment, avoided Rodolph's look, such pain had the disclosure cost her. "Ah, now," said Rodolph, after a long silence, "I can understand the cause of M. d'Harville's sadness, which I could not before account for. I can imagine his regrets." "His regrets!" exclaimed Clémence. "Say his remorse, monseigneur, if he have any, for never was such a crime more coolly meditated." "A crime, madame?" "What else is it, my lord, to bind to yourself in indissoluble bonds a young girl who confides in your honour when you are fatally stricken with a malady which inspires fear and horror? What else is it to devote with certainty an unhappy child to similar misery? What forced M. d'Harville to make two victims? A blind, insensate passion? No, he found my birth, my fortune, and my person to his taste. He wished to make a convenient marriage, because, doubtless, a bachelor's life wearied him." "Madame, at least pity him." "Pity him? If you wish pity, pray let it be bestowed on my child. Poor victim of this odious union, what nights and days have I passed near her! What tears have not her misfortunes wrung from me!" "But her father suffers from the same unmerited afflictions." "Yet it is that father who has condemned her to a sickly infancy, a withering youth, and, if she should survive, to a life of isolation and misery, for she will never marry. Ah, no! I love her too well to expose her to the chance of one day's weeping over her own offspring, similarly smitten as I weep over her. I have suffered too much from treachery, to render myself guilty of or an accomplice in such wickedness." "You are right. The vengeance of your mother in law was really atrocious. But patience, and perhaps in your turn you will be avenged," said Rodolph, after a moment's reflection. "What do you mean, my lord?" inquired Clémence, astonished at the change in his voice. "I have generally had the satisfaction of seeing those whom I have known to be wicked most severely punished," he replied, in a voice that made Clémence shudder. "But the day after this unhappy event, what did your husband say?" "He confessed, with singular candour, that his two former marriages had been broken off in consequence of the family's becoming acquainted with the secret of his fearful malady. Thus, then, after having been twice rejected, he had the shameful, the unmanly courage, to drag a third poor victim into the abyss of misery the kind intervention of friends had preserved the others from. And this is what the world calls a gentleman and a man of honour! For one so good, so full of pity to others, yours are harsh words." "Because I feel I have been unworthily treated. M. d'Harville easily penetrated the girlish openness of my character. Why, then, did he not trust to my sympathy and generosity of feeling, and tell me the whole truth?" "Because you would have refused him." "This very expression proves how guilty he was, and how treacherous was his conduct, if he really entertained the idea of my rejecting his hand if informed of the truth." "He loved you too well to incur the risk of losing you." "No, no, my lord. Had he really loved me, he would never have sacrificed me to his selfish passion. Nay, so wretched was my position at that time, and such was my desire to quit my father's roof, that, had he been candid and explicit with me, it is more than probable he would have moved me to pity the species of misery he was condemned to endure, and to sympathise with one so cut off from the tender ties which sweeten life. I really believe, at this moment, that, touched by his open, manly confession, as well as interested for one labouring under so severe an affliction of the Almighty's hand, I should scarcely have had the courage to refuse him my hand; and, once aware of all I had undertaken, nothing should have deterred me from the full and conscientious discharge of every solemn duty towards him. But to compel this pity and interest, merely because he had me in his power, and to exact my consideration and sympathy because, unhappily, I was his wife, and had sworn to obligations, the full force of which had been concealed from me, was at once the act of a coward and a wrong-judging mind. How could I hold myself bound to endure the heavy penalties of my unfortunate marriage, when my husband had trampled on every tie which binds an honourable mind? And now, my lord, you may form some little idea of my wedded life. You are now aware how shamefully I was deceived, and that, too, by the person in whose hands I unsuspectingly placed the future happiness of my whole existence. I had implicitly trusted in M. d'Harville, and he had most dishonourably and treacherously repaid my trustfulness with bitter and irremediable wrongs. The gentle, timid melancholy which had so greatly interested me in his favour, and which he attributed to pious recollections, was, in truth, only the workings of a conscience ill at ease, and the knowledge of his own incurable infirmity. Still, were he a stranger or an enemy, a heart so noble and generous as yours would pity such sufferings as he endures. But can I calm those sufferings? If he could distinguish my voice, or if only a look of recognition answered my sorrowing glance! But no. Oh, my lord, it is impossible for such as have never seen them to form an idea of those frightful paroxysms, in which every sense is suspended, and the unfortunate sufferer merely recovers from his frenzy to fall into a sort of sullen dejection. When my dear child experiences one of these attacks, it almost breaks my heart to see her tender frame twisted, stiffened, and distorted by the dreadful convulsions which accompany it. Still she is my own, my beloved infant, and when I see her bitter agonies, my hatred and aversion to her father are increased an hundredfold. But when my poor child becomes calmer, so does my irritation against my husband subside also. And then, then, the natural tenderness of my heart makes my angry feelings give place to a species of sorrow and pity for him. Yet surely I did not marry at only 17 years of age merely to experience the alternations of hatred and painful commiseration, and to weep over a frail and sickly infant, whom, after all, I may not be permitted to rear. And, as regards this beloved object of my incessant prayers, permit me, my lord, to anticipate a reproach I doubtless deserve, and which you would be unwilling to make. My daughter, young as she is capable of interesting my affections and fully occupying my heart; but the love she inspires is so cruelly mixed with present anguish and future apprehensions, that my tenderness for my child invariably ends in tears and bitter grief. When I am with her, my heart is torn with agony, a heavy, crushing weight presses on my heart at the thoughts of her hopeless, suffering state. Not all the fondest devices of a mother's love can overcome a malady pronounced by all our faculty as incurable. Thus, then, by way of relief and refuge from the atmosphere of wretchedness which surrounded me, I had pictured to myself the possibility of finding calm and repose for my troubled spirit in an attachment so vain, so empty that— But I have been deceived a second time, most unworthily deceived, and there is now nothing left for me but to resign myself to the gloom and misery of the life my husband's want of candour has entailed upon me. But tell me, my lord, is it such an existence as I was justified in expecting when I bestowed my hand on M. d'Harville? And am I alone to blame for those injuries, to avenge which my husband had this day determined to take my life? My fault was great, very great, and the more so because the object I had selected was every way so unworthy, and leaves me the additional shame of having to blush for my choice. Happily for me, my lord, the conversation you overheard between the Countess Sarah and her brother on the subject of M. Charles Robert spares me much of the humiliation I should otherwise have experienced in making this confession. I only venture to hope that, since, listening to my relation, you may be induced to consider me as much an object of pity as I admit I am of blame. I cannot express to you, madame, how deeply your narrative has touched me. What gnawing grief, what hidden sorrows have you not been called upon to endure, from the death of your mother to the birth of your child? Who would ever believe such ills could reach one so envied, so admired, and so calculated to enjoy and impart happiness to others? Oh, my lord, there are some sorrows so deep, so unapproachable, that for worlds we would not even have them suspected. And the severest increase of suffering would arise from the very doubt of our being the enviable creatures we are believed to be. You are right. Nothing would be more painful than the question openly expressed, is she or is he as happy as they seem to be? Still, if there is any happiness in the knowledge, be assured you are not the only one who has to struggle with the fearful contrast between reality and that which the world believes. How so, my lord? Because, in the eyes of all who know you, your husband is esteemed even happier than yourself, since he possesses one so rich in every good gift; and yet is not he also much to be pitied? Can there be a more miserable existence than the one he leads? He has acted unfairly and selfishly towards you, but has he not been bitterly punished? He loves you with a passion deep and sincere, worthy of you to have inspired, yet he knows that your only feeling towards him is insurmountable aversion and contempt. In his feeble, suffering child he beholds a constant reproach, nor is that all he is called upon to endure. Jealousy also assails him with her nameless tortures. And how can I help that, my lord? By giving him no occasion for jealousy, you reply. And certainly you are right. But think you, because no other person would possess my love, it would any the more be his? He knows full well it would not. Since the fearful scene I related to you, we have lived entirely apart, while in the eyes of the world I have kept up every necessary appearance of married happiness. With the exception of yourself, my lord, I have never breathed a syllable of this fatal secret to mortal ears. Thus, therefore, I venture to ask advice of you I could not solicit from any human being. And I, madame, can with truth assure you that, if the trifling service I have rendered you be deemed worthy of notice, I hold myself 1,000 times overpaid by the confidence you have reposed in me. But since you deign to ask my advice, and permit me to speak candidly— Oh, yes, my lord, I beseech you to use the frankness and sincerity you would show to a sister. Then allow me to tell you that, for want of employing one of your most precious qualities, you lose vast enjoyments, which would not only fill up that void in your heart, but would distract you from your domestic sorrows and supply that need of stirring emotions, excitement, and, added the prince, smiling, I dare almost to venture to add, pray forgive me for having so bad an opinion of your sex, that natural love for mystery and intrigue which exercises so powerful an empire over many, if not all, females. What do you mean, my lord? I mean that, if you would play at the game of doing good, nothing would please or interest you more. Madame d'Harville surveyed Rodolph with astonishment. And understand, resumed he, I speak not of sending large sums carelessly, almost disdainfully, to unfortunate creatures of whom you know nothing, and who are frequently undeserving of your favour. But if you would amuse yourself as I do at playing, from time to time, at the game of Providence, you would acknowledge that occasionally our good deeds put on all the piquancy and charms of a romance. I must confess, my lord, said Clémence with a smile, it never occurred to me to class charity under the head of amusements. It is a discovery I owe to my horror of all tediums, all wearisome, long protracted affairs, a sort of horror which has been principally inspired by long political conferences and ministerial discussions. But to return to our game of amusing beneficence, I cannot, alas, aspire to possess that disinterested virtue which makes some people content to entrust others with the office of either ill or well distributing their bounty, and if it merely required me to send one of my chamberlains to carry a few hundred louis to each of the divisions in and around Paris, I confess, to my shame, that the scheme would not interest me nearly as much as it does at present, while doing good, after my notions on the subject, is one of the most entertaining and exciting amusements you can imagine. I prefer the word amusing, because to me it conveys the idea of all that pleases, charms, and allures us. And really, madame, If you would only become my accomplice in a few dark intrigues of this sort, you would see that, apart from the praiseworthiness of the action, nothing is really more curious, inviting, attractive, or diverting, than these charitable adventures. And then, what mystery is requisite to conceal the benefits we render? What precautions to prevent ourselves from being discovered? What varied, yet powerful, emotions are excited at the aspect of poor but worthy people shedding tears of joy, and calling down Heaven's blessing on your head! Depend upon it, such a group is, after all, more gratifying than the pale, angry countenance of either a jealous or an unfaithful lover, and there are very few who do not class either under one head or the other. The emotions I describe are closely allied to those you experienced this morning while going to the Rue du Temple. Simply dressed, that you may escape observation, you go forth with a palpitating heart. You also ascend with a throbbing breast some modest fiacre, carefully drawing down the blinds to prevent yourself from being seen. Then, looking cautiously from side to side that you are not observed, you quickly enter a mean-looking dwelling, just like this morning, you see, the only difference being that, whereas to day you said, 'If I am discovered, I am lost,' then you would only smile as you mentally uttered, 'If I am discovered, they will overwhelm me with praises and blessings.' Now, since you possess your many adorable qualities in all their pure modesty, you would employ the most artful schemes, the most complicated manoeuvres, to prevent yourself from being known, and, consequently, wept over and blessed as an angel of goodness." "Ah, my lord," cried Madame d'Harville, deeply moved, "you are indeed my preserver! I cannot express the new ideas, the consoling hopes, awakened within me by your words. You are quite right. To endeavour to gain the blessing and gratitude of such as are poor and in misery is almost equal to being loved even as I would wish to be. Nay, it is even superior in its purity and absence of self. When I compare the existence I now venture to anticipate with the shameful and degraded lot I was preparing for myself, my own reproaches become more bitter and severe." "I should, indeed, be grieved," said Rodolph, smiling, "were that to be the case, since all my desire is to make you forget the past, and to prove to you that there are various modes of recreating and distracting our minds. The means of good and evil are very frequently nearly the same. It is the end only which differs. In a word, if good is as attractive, as amusing, as evil, why should we prefer the latter? I am going to use a very commonplace and hackneyed simile. Why do many women take as lovers men not nearly as worthy of that distinction as their own husbands? Because the greatest charm of love consists in the difficulties which surround it; for once deprived of the hopes, the fears, the anxieties, difficulties, mysteries, and dangers, and little or nothing would remain, merely the lover, stripped of all the prestige derivable from these causes, and a very every-day object he would appear, very much after the fashion of the individual who, when asked by a friend why he did not marry his mistress, replied, 'Why, I was thinking of it; but if I did, where should I go to pass my evenings?'" "Your picture is coloured after nature, my lord," said Madame d'Harville, smiling. "Well, then, if I can find the means of enabling you to experience the fears, the anxieties, the excitement, which seem to have such charms for you, if I can render useful your natural love for mystery and romance, your inclination for dissimulation and artifice, you see my bad opinion of your sex will peep out in spite of me," added Rodolph, gaily. "Shall I not change into fine and generous qualities instincts which otherwise are mere ungovernable and unmanageable impulses, excellent if well employed, most fatal if directed badly? Now, then, what do you say? Shall we get up all manner of benevolent plots and charitable dissipations? We will have our rendezvous, our correspondence, our secrets; and, above all, we will carefully conceal all our doings from the marquis, for your visit of to day to the Morels has, in all probability, excited his suspicions. There, you see, it only requires your consent to commence a regular intrigue." "I accept with joy and gratitude the mysterious associations you propose, my lord," said Clémence; "and, by way of beginning our romance, I will return to morrow to visit those poor creatures to whom, unfortunately, this morning I could only utter a few words of consolation; for, taking advantage of my terror and alarm, the purse you so thoughtfully supplied me with was stolen from me by a lame boy as I ascended the stairs." "Ah, my lord," added Clémence, and her countenance lost the expression of gentle gaiety by which a few minutes before it was animated. "If you only knew what misery, what a picture of wretchedness! No, oh, no, I never could have believed so horrid a scene, or that such want existed; and yet I bewail my condition and complain of my severe destiny." Rodolph, wishing to conceal from Madame d'Harville how deeply he was touched at this application of the woes of others, as teaching patience and resignation, yet fully recognising in the meek and subdued spirit the fine and noble qualities of her mind, said gaily: "With your permission, I shall accept the Morels from your jurisdiction; you shall resign them to my care, and, above all things, promise me not again to enter that miserable place, for, to tell you the truth, I live there." "You, my lord? What an idea!" "Nay, but you really must believe me when I say I live there, for it is actually true. I confess mine is somewhat a humble lodging, a mere matter of £8 a year, in addition to which I pay the large and liberal sum of 6 francs a month to the porteress, Madame Pipelet, that ugly old woman you saw; but, to make up for all this, I have as my next neighbour Mlle. Rigolette, the prettiest grisette in the Quartier du Temple; and you must allow that, for a merchant's clerk, with a salary of only £72 a year (I pass as a clerk), such a domicile is well suited to my means." "Your unhoped for presence in that fatal house proves to me that you are speaking seriously, my lord. Some generous action leads you there, no doubt. But what good action do you reserve for me? What part do you propose for me to sustain?" "That of an angel of consolation, and, pray excuse and allow me the word, a very demon of cunning and manoeuvres; for there are some wounds so painful, as well as delicate, that the hand of a woman only can watch over and heal them. There are also unfortunate beings so proud, so reserved, and so hidden from observation, that it requires uncommon penetration to discover them, and an irresistible charm to win their confidence." "And when shall I have an opportunity of displaying the penetration and skill for which you give me credit?" asked Madame d'Harville, impatiently. "Soon, I hope. You will have to make a conquest worthy of you; but, to succeed, you must employ all your most ingenious resources." "And when, my lord, will you confide this great secret to me?" "Let me see. You perceive, we have already got as far as arranging our rendezvous. Could you do me the favour to grant me an audience in 4 days' time?" "Dear me, so long first?" said Clémence, innocently. "But what would become of the mystery of the affair, and all the strict forms and appearances necessary to be kept up, if we were to meet sooner? Just imagine! If our partnership were suspected, people would be on their guard, and we should seldom achieve our purpose. I may very probably have to write to you. Who was that aged female who brought me your note?" "An old servant of my mother's, the very personification of prudence and discretion." "I will then address my letters under cover to her, and she will deliver them into your hands. If you are kind enough to return any answer, address to M. Rodolph, Rue Plumet, and let your maid put your letters in the post." "I will do that myself, my lord, when taking my usual morning's walk." "Do you often walk out alone?" "In fine weather, nearly every day." "That's right. It is a custom all young women should observe from the very earliest period of their marriage, either from a good or an improper provision against future evil. The habit once established, it becomes what the lawyers style a precedent, and in subsequent days these habitual promenades excite no dangerous interpretations. If I had been a woman, and, between ourselves, I fear I should have been very charitable, but equally flighty, the very day after my marriage, I should, in all possible innocence, have taken the most mysterious steps, and, with perfect simplicity, have involved myself in all manner of suspicious and compromising proceedings, for the purpose of establishing the precedent I spoke of, in order to be at liberty either to visit my poor pensioners, or to meet my lover." "But that would be downright perfidy to one's husband, would it not, my lord?" said Madame d'Harville, smiling. "Fortunately for you, madame, you have never been driven to the necessity of admitting the utility of such provisionary measures." Madame d'Harville's smile left her lips. She cast down her eyes, and, blushing deeply, said, in a low and sad voice, "This is not generous, my lord." At first Rodolph regarded the marquise with astonishment, then added, "I understand you, madame; But, once for all, let us weigh well your position as regards M. Charles Robert. I will just imagine that one of your acquaintances may one day have pointed out to you one of those pitiable looking mendicants who roll their eyes most sentimentally, and play on the clarionet with desperate energy, to awaken the sympathy of the passers by. That is really and truly a genuine case of distress, observes your friend. That interesting musician has at least 7 children, and a wife deaf, dumb, blind, etc. Ah, poor fellow, you reply, charitably aiding him with your purse. And so, each time you meet this case of genuine distress, the clarionet player, the moment he discerns you from afar, fixes his imploring eyes upon you, while the most touching strains of his instrument are directed to touch your charitable sympathies, and that, too, so successfully, that again your purse opens at this fresh appeal. One day, more than usually disposed to pity this very unfortunate object by the importunities of the friend who first pointed him out to you, and who is most wickedly abusing your generous heart, you resolve to visit this case of genuine distress, as your false friend terms it, and to behold the poor object of your solicitude in the midst of his misery. Well, you go; but lo! the grief-stricken musician has vanished, and in his place you find a lively, rollicking fellow, enjoying himself over some of the good things of this world, and mirthfully carolling forth the last new alehouse catch. Then disgust succeeds to pity, for you have bestowed your sympathy and charity alike upon an impostor, neither more nor less. Is it not so?" Madame d'Harville could not restrain a smile at this singular apologue. She, however, soon checked it, as she added, "However grateful I may feel for this mode of justifying my great imprudence, my lord, I can but confess I dare not avail myself of so favourable a pretext as that of a mistaken charity." "Yet, after all, yours was an error based upon motives of noble and generous pity for the wounded feelings of one you believed a genuine object for commiseration. Fortunately, there are so many ways left you of atoning for one indiscretion, that your regret need be but small. Shall I not have the pleasure of seeing M. d'Harville this evening?" "No, my lord. The scene of this morning has so much affected him that he is ill," said the marquise, in a low, tremulous tone. "Ah," replied Rodolph, sadly, "I understand. Come, courage! You were saying that you required an aim, a motive, a means of directing your thoughts. Permit me to hope that all this will be accomplished by following out the plan I have proposed. Your heart will be then so filled with the delightful recollection of all the happiness you have caused, and all the good you have effected, that, in all probability, you will find no room for resentment against your husband. In place of angry feelings, you will regard him with the same sorrowing pity you look on your dear child. And as for the interesting little creature herself, now you have confided to me the cause of her delicate health, I almost think myself warranted in bidding you yet to entertain hopes of overcoming the fearful complaint which has hitherto affected her tender frame." "Oh, my lord!" exclaimed Clémence, clasping her hands with eagerness, "can it be possible? How? In what manner can my child be saved?" "I have, as physician to myself and household, a man almost unknown, though possessed of a first-rate science. Great part of his life was passed in America, and I remember his speaking to me of some marvellous cures performed by him on slaves attacked by this distressing complaint." "And do you really think, my lord—" "Nay, you must not allow yourself to dwell too confidently upon success; the disappointment would be so very severe. Only, do not let us wholly despair." Clémence d'Harville cast a hasty glance of unutterable gratitude over the noble features of Rodolph, the firm, unflinching friend, who reconciled her to herself with so much good sense, intelligence, and delicacy of feeling. Then she asked herself how, for one instant, she could ever have been interested in the fate of such a being as M. Charles Robert. The very idea was hateful to her. "What do I not owe you, my lord?" cried she, in a voice of thrilling emotion. "You console me for the past, you open to me a glimpse of hope for my child, and you place before me a plan of future occupation which shall afford me both consolation and the delight of doing my duty. Ah, was I not right when I said that, if you would come here to night, you would finish the day as you had begun it, by performing a good action?" "And pray, madame, do not omit to add, an action after my own heart, where all is pleasure and unmixed enjoyment in its performance. And now, adieu!" said Rodolph, rising as the clock struck 11:30. "Adieu, my lord; and pray do not forget to send me news ere long of those poor people in the Rue du Temple." "I will see them to morrow, for, unfortunately, I knew not of that little limping rascal having stolen your purse; and I fear that the unhappy creatures are in the most deplorable want. Have the kindness to bear in mind that, in the course of 4 days, I shall come to explain to you the nature of the part you will be required to undertake. One thing I must prepare you for, and that is, the probability of its being requisite for you to assume a disguise on the occasion." "A disguise? Oh, how charming! What sort of one, my lord?" "I cannot tell you at present. I will leave the choice to you." "All that is requisite," said the prince on his return home, "to save this excellent woman from the perils of another attachment, is to fill her mind with generous thoughts, and, since an invincible repugnance separates her from her husband, to employ her love for the romantic in such charitable actions as shall require being enshrouded in mystery." CHAPTER XI. Read by Celine Major. Chapter 12, Part 1 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue. Chapter 12, Part 1. Misery. The reader has probably not forgotten that the garret in the Rue du Temple was occupied by an unfortunate family, the father of whom was a working lapidary, named Morel. We shall now endeavour to describe the wretched abode of Morel and his children. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. A deep silence dwelt around. The streets were still deserted, for the snow fell fast, and the cold, biting wind froze as it blew. A miserable candle, stuck upon a small block of wood, and supported by 2 slips of the same material, scarcely penetrated with its yellow, flickering light the misty darkness of the garret, a narrow, low-built place, 2/3 of which were formed by the sloping roof, which communicated by a sharp angle with the wretched flooring, and freely exposed the moss-covered tiles of the outer roof. Walls covered with plaster, blackened by time, and split into countless crevices, displayed the rotten, worm-eaten laths which formed the frail division from other chambers, while in one corner of this deplorable habitation a door off the hinges opened upon a narrow staircase. The ground, of a nameless colour, but foul, fetid, and slippery, was partly strewed with bits of dirty straw, old rags, and bones, the residue of that unwholesome and vitiated food sold by the dealers in condemned meat, and frequently bought by starving wretches, for the purpose of gnawing the few cartilages that may adhere. Note 4. It is no uncommon thing to meet, in densely crowded parts of Paris, with persons who openly sell the flesh of animals born dead, as well as of others who have died of disease, etc. So wretched a condition either arises from improvidence and vice, or from unavoidable misery, misery so great, so overwhelming and paralysing as to enfeeble every energy, and to render the unhappy object of it too hopeless, too despairing, even to attempt to extricate himself from the squalor of his utter destitution, and he crouches in his dirt and desolation like an animal in its den. During the day, Morel's garret was lighted by a species of long, narrow skylight formed in the descending roof, framed and glazed, and made to open and shut by means of a pulley and string. But, at the hour which we are describing, a heavy fall of snow encumbered the window, and effectually prevented its affording any light. The candle placed on Morel's working table, which stood in the centre of the chamber, diffused a kind of halo of pale, sickly beams, which, gradually diminishing, was at last lost in the dim shadow which overspread the place, in whose murky duskiness might be seen the faint outline of several white-looking masses. On the work-table, which was merely a heavy and roughly cut wooden block of unpolished oak, covered with grease and soot, lay, loosely scattered about, a handful of rubies and diamonds of more than ordinary size and brilliancy, while, as the mean rays of the small candle were reflected on them, they glittered and sparkled like so many coruscating fires. Morel was a worker of real stones, and not false ones, as he had given out, and was universally believed in the Rue du Temple. Thanks to this innocent deception, the costly jewels entrusted to him were merely supposed to be so many pieces of glass, too valueless to tempt the cupidity of any one. Such riches, confided to the care of one as poor and miserably destitute as Morel, will render any reference to the honesty of his character quite unnecessary. Seated on a high stool, and wholly overcome by fatigue, cold, and weariness, after a long winter's night passed in unceasing labour, the poor lapidary had fallen asleep on his block, with his head upon his half-frozen arms, and his forehead resting against a small grindstone placed horizontally on the table, and generally put in motion by a little hand-wheel, while a fine steel saw, and various other tools belonging to his trade, were lying beside him. The man himself, of whom nothing but the skull, surrounded by a fringe of gray hairs, was visible, was dressed in a shabby fustian jacket, without any species of linen or garment underneath it, and an old pair of cloth trousers, while his worn-out slippers scarcely concealed the blue, cold feet they partially covered, from resting solely on the damp, shiny floor. And so bitter, so freezing, was the sharp winter wind which freely entered into this scarcely human dwelling, that, spite of the weariness and exhaustion of the overworked artisan, his frame shuddered and shivered with involuntary frequency. The length of the wick of the unsnuffed candle bespoke the length of time even this uneasy slumber must have lasted, and no sound save his troubled and irregular breathing broke the death-like silence that prevailed. For, alas! the other occupants of this mean abode were not so fortunate as to be able to forget their sufferings in sleep. Yet this narrow, pent-up, unwholesome spot contained no less than 7 other persons. 5 children, the youngest of whom was 4 years of age, the eldest 12, a sick and declining wife, with an aged grandmother, the parent of Morel's wife, now in her 80th year, and an idiot. The cold must have been intense indeed, when the natural warmth of so many persons so closely packed together in so small a place could not in any way affect the freezing atmosphere. It was evident, therefore, to speak scientifically, that but little caloric was given out by the poor, weak, emaciated, shivering creatures, all suffering and almost expiring with cold and hunger, from the puny infant to the idiotic old grandmother. With the exception of the father of the family, who had temporarily yielded to the aching of his heavy eyelids, no other creature slept, no other; because cold, starvation, and sickness will not allow so sweet an enjoyment as the closing the eyes in peaceful rest. Little does the world believe how rarely comes that sound, healthful and refreshing slumber to the poor man's pillow, which at once invigorates the mind and body, and sends the willing labourer back to his toil refreshed and recruited by the blessing of a beneficent Creator. To taste of nature's sweet, refreshing, balmy sleep, sickness, sorrow, poverty, and mental disquietude must not share the humble palate. In contrasting the deep misery of the poor artisan, with whose woes we are now occupying the reader, with the immense value of the jewelry confided to him, we are struck by one of those comparisons which afflict while they elevate the mind. While the distracting spectacle of his family's want and wretchedness, embracing a wide field from cold and hunger to drivelling idiocy, constantly before his eyes, this man, in the pursuance of his daily labour, is compelled to touch and handle and gaze upon bright and sparkling gems, the smallest of which would be a mine of wealth to him, and save those dearest to him from sufferings and privations which wring his very heart, would snatch them from the slow and lingering death which is consuming them before his eyes. Yet, amid all these trials and temptations, the artisan remains firmly, truly, and unflinchingly honest, and would no more appropriate one of the glittering stones entrusted to him than he would satisfy his hunger at the expense of his starving babes. Doubtless the man but performed his duty to his employer, his simple duty; but because it is enjoined to all to be honest and faithful in that which is committed to them, does that render the action itself less noble, magnanimous, or praiseworthy? Is not this unfortunate artisan, so courageously, so bravely upright and honest while entrusted with the property of another, the type and model of an immense class of working people, who, doomed to a life of continual poverty and privation, see with calm, patient looks thousands of their brethren rolling in splendour and abounding in riches, yet they toil on, resigned and unenvying, but still industriously striving for bread their hardest efforts cannot always procure? And is there not something consolatory, as well as gratifying to our feelings, to consider that there is neither force nor terror, but good natural sense and a right mind which alone restrain this formidable ocean, this heaving mass, whose bounds once broken, a moral inundation would ensue, in which society itself would be swallowed up. Shall we, then, refuse to co-operate with all the powers of our mind and body with those generous and enlightened spirits who ask but a little sunshine for so much misfortune, courage, and resignation? Let us now return to the, alas, too true specimen of distressing want we shall endeavour to describe in all its fearful and startling reality. The lapidary possessed only a thin mattress and a portion of a blanket appropriated to the old grandmother, who, in her stupid and ferocious selfishness, would not allow any person to share them with her. In the beginning of the winter she had become quite violent, and had even attempted to strangle the youngest child, who had been put to sleep with her. This poor infant was a sickly little creature, of about 4 years old, now far gone in consumption, and who found it too cold inside the mattress, where she slept with her brothers and sisters. Hereafter we shall explain this mode of sleeping so frequently employed by the very poor, in comparison with whom the very animals are treated luxuriously, for their litter is changed. Such was the picture presented in the humble garret of the poor lapidary, when the eye was enabled to pierce the glooming penumbra caused by the flickering rays of the candle. By the side of the partition wall, not less damp and cracked than the others, was placed on the floor the mattress on which the idiot grandmother reposed. As she could not bear anything on her head, her white hair was cut very short, and revealed the shape of her head and flat forehead, while her shaggy gray eyebrows shaded the deep orbits from which glared a wild, savage, yet crafty look. Her pale, hollow, wrinkled cheeks hung upon the bones of the face and the sharp angles of her jaws. Lying upon her side and almost doubled up, her chin nearly touching her knees, she lay, shivering with cold, beneath the gray rug, too small to cover her all over, and which, as she drew it over her shoulders, exposed her thin, emaciated legs, as well as the wretched old petticoat in which she was clad. An odour most fetid and repulsive issued from this bed. At a little distance from the mattress of the grandmother, and still extending along the side of the wall, was placed the paillasse which served as a sleeping place for the 5 children, who were accommodated after the following manner. An opening was made at each side of the cloth which covered the straw, and the children were inserted into this bed, or rather foul and noisome dunghill, the outer case serving both for sheet and counterpane. 2 little girls, one of whom was extremely ill, shivered on one side, and 3 young boys on the other, all going to bed without undressing, if, indeed, the miserable rags they wore could be termed clothes. Masses of thick, dry, light hair, tangled, ragged, and uncombed, left uncut because their poor mother fancied it helped to keep them warm, half covered their pale, thin, pinched features. One of the boys drew, with his cold, benumbed fingers, the covering over their straw bed up to his chin, in order to defend himself from the cold; while another, fearful of exposing his hands to the influence of the frost, tried to grasp the bed covering with his teeth, which rattled and shook in his head; while a third strove to huddle up to his brothers in the hopes of gaining a little warmth. The youngest of the 2 girls, fatally attacked by consumption, leaned her poor little face, which already bore the hue of death, languidly against the chilly bosom of her sister, a girl just 1 year older, who vainly sought, by pressing her in her arms, to impart comfort and ease to the little sufferer, over whom she watched with the anxious solicitude of a parent. On another paillasse, also placed on the ground, at the foot of that of the children, the wife of the artisan was extended, groaning in helpless exhaustion from the effects of a slow fever and an internal complaint, which had not permitted her to quit her bed for several months. Madeleine Morel was in her 36th year. A blue cotton handkerchief, tied round her low forehead, made the bilious pallor of her countenance and sharp, emaciated features still more conspicuous. A dark halo encircled her hollow, sunken eyes, while her lips were split and bleeding from the effects of the fever which consumed her. Her dejected, grief-worn physiognomy, and small, insignificant features, indicated one of those gentle but weak natures, without resource or energy, which, unable to struggle with misfortunes, yield at once, and know no remedy but vain and ceaseless lamentations and regrets. Weak, spiritless, and of limited capacity, she had remained honest because her husband was so. Had she been left to herself, it is probable that ignorance and misfortune might have depraved her mind and driven her to any lengths. She loved her husband and her children, but she had neither the courage nor resolution to restrain giving vent to loud and open complaints respecting their mutual misery, and frequently was the lapidary, whose unflinching labour alone maintained the family, obliged to quit his work to console and pacify the poor valetudinarian. Over and above an old ragged sheet of coarse brown cloth, which partially covered his wife, Morel had, in order to impart a little warmth, laid a few old clothes, so worn out and patched and pieced, that the pawnbroker had refused to have anything to do with them. A stove, a saucepan, a damaged earthen stewpan, 2 or 3 cracked cups, scattered about on the floor, a bucket, a board to wash on, and a large stone pitcher, placed beneath the angle of the roof near the broken door, which the wind kept continually blowing to and fro, completed the whole of the family possessions. This picture of squalid misery and desolation was lighted up by the candle, whose flame, agitated by the cold northeasterly wind which found its way through the tiles on the roof, sometimes imparted a pale, unearthly light on the wretched scene, and then, playing on the heaps of diamonds and rubies lying beside the sleeping artisan, caused 1,000 scintillating sparks to spring forth and dazzle the eye with their prismatic rays of brightness. Although the profoundest silence reigned around, 7 out of the 8 unfortunate dwellers in this attic were awake, and each, from the grandmother to the youngest child, watched the sleeping lapidary with intense emotion, as their only hope, their only resource, and, in their childlike selfishness, they murmured at seeing him thus inactive and relinquishing that labour which they well knew was all they had to depend on. But with different feelings of regret and uneasiness did the lookers-on observe the slumber of the toil-worn man. The mother trembled for her children's meal; the children thought but of themselves, while the idiot neither thought of nor cared for any one. All at once she sat upright, in her wretched bed, crossed her long bony arms, yellow and dry as boxwood, on her shrivelled bosom, and kept watching the candle with twinkling eyes. Then, rising slowly and stealthily, she crept along, trailing after her old ragged coverlet, which clung around her as though it had been her winding sheet. She was above the middle height, and her hair, being so closely shaven, made her head appear disproportionately small. A sort of spasmodic movement kept up a constant trembling in her thick, pendulous underlip, while her whole countenance offered the hideous model of ferocious stupidity. Slowly and cautiously the idiot approached the lapidary's work-table, like a child about to commit some forbidden act. When she reached the candle, she held her 2 trembling hands over the flame, and such was their skeleton-like condition that the flickering light shone through them, imparting a pale, livid hue to her features. From her pallet Madeleine Morel watched every movement of the old woman, who, still warming herself over the candle, stooped her head, and, with a silly kind of delight, watched the sparkling of the diamonds and rubies, which lay glittering on the table. Wholly absorbed in the wondrous contemplation of such bright and beautiful things, the idiot allowed her hands to fall into the flame of the candle, nor did she seem to recollect where they were till the sense of burning recalled her attention, when she manifested her pain and anger by a harsh, screaming cry. At this sound Morel started, and quickly raised his head. He was about 40 years of age, with an open, intelligent, and mild expression of countenance, but yet wearing the sad, dejected look of one who had been the sport of misery and misfortune till they had planted furrows in his cheeks and crushed and broken his spirit. A gray beard of many weeks' growth covered the lower part of his face, which was deeply marked by the smallpox. Premature wrinkles furrowed his already bald forehead, while his red and inflamed eyelids showed the overtaxed and sleepless days and nights of toil he so courageously endured. A circumstance but too common with such of the working class are doomed by their occupation to remain nearly all day in one position, had warped his figure, and, acting upon a naturally feeble constitution, had produced a contraction of his whole frame. Continually obliged to stoop over his work-table and to lean to the left, in order to keep his grindstone going, the lapidary, in a manner petrified, ossified in the attitude he was frequently obliged to preserve from 12 to 15 hours a day, had acquired an habitual stoop of the shoulders, and was completely drawn on one side. So his left arm, incessantly exercised by the difficult management of the grindstone, had acquired a considerable muscular development, whilst the right arm, always inert and leaning on the table, the better to present the faces of the diamonds to the action of the grindstone, had wasted to the most extreme attenuation. His wasted limbs, almost paralysed by complete want of exercise, could scarcely support the weary, worn-out body, as though all strength, substance, and vitality had concentrated themselves in the only part called into play when toiling for the substance of, with himself, 8 human creatures. And often would poor Morel touchingly observe, "It is not for myself that I care to eat, but to give strength to the arm which turns the mill." Awaking with a sudden start, the lapidary found himself directly opposite to the poor idiot. "What ails you? What is the matter, mother?" said Morel, and then added in a lower tone, for fear of awaking the family, whom he hoped and believed were asleep, "Go back to bed, mother. Madeleine and the children are asleep." "No, father," cried the eldest of the little girls, "I am awake. I am trying to warm poor little Adèle." "And I am too hungry to go to sleep," added one of the boys. "It was not my turn to night to have supper with Mlle. Rigolette." "Poor things!" said Morel, sorrowfully. "I thought you were asleep, at least." "I was afraid of awaking you, Morel," said the wife, "or I should have begged of you to give me a drink of water. I am devoured with thirst. My feverish fit has come on again." "I will directly," said the lapidary; "only let me first get mother back to bed. Come, come, what are you meddling with those stones for? Let them alone, I say!" cried he to the old woman, whose whole attention seemed riveted upon a splendid ruby, the bright scintillations of which had so charmed the poor idiot that she was trying by every possible means to gain possession of it. "There's a pretty thing! There, there!" replied the woman, pointing with vehement gestures to the prize she so ardently coveted. "I shall be angry in a few minutes," exclaimed Morel, speaking in a loud voice, to terrify his mother in law into submission, and gently pushing back the hand she advanced to seize her desired treasure. "Oh, Morel, Morel!" murmured Madeleine, "I am parching, dying with thirst. How can you be so cruel as to refuse me a little water?" "But how can I at present? I must not allow mother to meddle with these stones, perhaps to lose me a diamond as she did a year ago. And God alone knows the wretchedness and misery it cost us, may still occasion us. Ah, that unfortunate loss of the diamond, what have we not suffered by it!" As the poor lapidary uttered these words, he passed his hand over his aching brow with a desponding air, and said to one of the children, "Felix, give your mother something to drink. You are awake, and can attend to her." "No, no!" exclaimed Madeleine; "he will take cold. I will wait." "Oh, mother," said the boy, rising, "never mind me. I shall be quite as warm up as I am in this paillasse." "Come, will you let the things alone?" cried Morel, in a threatening tone, to the idiot woman, who kept bending over the precious stones, and trying to seize them, spite of all his efforts to move her from the table. "Mother," called out Felix, "what shall I do? The water in the pitcher is frozen quite hard." "Then break the ice," murmured Madeleine. "It is so thick I can't," answered the boy. "Morel," exclaimed Madeleine, in a querulous and impatient tone, "since there is nothing but water for me to drink, let me at least have a draught of that. You are letting me die with thirst." "God of heaven grant me patience!" cried the unfortunate man. "How can I leave your mother to lose and destroy these stones? Pray let me manage her first." But the lapidary found it no easy matter to get rid of the idiot, who, beginning to feel irritated at the constant opposition she met with, gave utterance to her displeasure in a sort of hideous growl. "Call her, wife," said Morel; "she will attend to you sometimes." "Mother, mother!" called Madeleine, "go to bed, and be good, and then you shall have some of that nice coffee you are so fond of." "I want that, and that. There, there!" replied the idiot, making a desperate effort this time to possess herself of a heap of rubies she particularly coveted. Morel firmly but gently repulsed her, all in vain. With pertinacious obstinacy the old woman kept struggling to break from his grasp and snatch the bright gems, on which she kept her eyes fixed with eager fondness. "You will never manage her," said Madeleine, "unless you frighten her with the whip. There is no other means of making her quiet." "I am afraid not," returned Morel; "but, though she has no sense, it yet goes to my heart to be obliged to threaten an old woman like her with the whip." Then, addressing the old woman, who was trying to bite him, and whom he was holding back with one hand, he said, in a loud and terrible voice, "Take care, you'll have the whip on your shoulders if you don't make haste to bed this very instant." These menaces were equally vain with his former efforts to subdue her. Morel then took a whip which lay beside his work table, and cracking it violently, said, "Get to bed with you directly! Get to bed!" As the loud noise of the whip saluted the ear of the idiot, she hurried away from the lapidary's work table, then, suddenly turning around, she uttered low, grumbling sounds between her clenched teeth, while she surveyed her son-in-law with looks of the deepest hatred. "To bed, I say!" continued he, still advancing, and feigning to raise his whip with the intention of striking; while the idiot, holding her fist towards her son-in-law, retreated backwards to her wretched couch. The lapidary, anxious to terminate this painful scene, that he might be at liberty to attend to his sick wife, kept still advancing towards the idiot woman, brandishing and cracking his whip, though without allowing it to touch the unhappy creature, repeatedly exclaiming, "To bed! To bed, directly! Do you hear?" The old woman, now thoroughly conquered, and fully believing in the reality of the threats held out, began to howl most hideously; and, crawling into her bed, like a dog to his kennel, she kept up a continued series of cries, screams, and yells, while the frightened children, believing their poor old grandmother had actually been beaten, began crying piteously, exclaiming, "Don't beat poor granny, father! Pray don't flog granny!" Chapter 12. Read by Celine Major. Chapter 12, Part 2 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Chapter 12, Part 2. It is wholly impossible to describe the fearful effect of these nocturnal horrors, in which were mingled, in one turmoil of sounds, the supplicating cries of the children, the furious yellings of the idiot, and the wailing complaints of the lapidary's sick wife. To poor Morel such scenes as this were but too frequent. Still, upon the present occasion, his patience and courage seemed utterly to forsake him, and, throwing down the whip upon his work table, he exclaimed, in bitter despair, "Oh, what a life! What a life!" "Is it my fault if my mother is an idiot?" asked Madeleine, weeping. "Is it mine, then?" replied Morel. "All I ask for is peace and quiet enough to allow me to work myself to death for you all. God knows, I labour alike night and day, yet I complain not; and, as long as my strength holds out, I will exert myself to the utmost. But it is quite impossible for me to attend to my business, and be at once a keeper to a mad woman and a nurse to sick people and young children. And Heaven is unjust to put it upon me. Yes, I say unjust. It is too much misery to heap on one man," added Morel, in a tone bordering on distraction. So saying, the heart-broken lapidary threw himself on his stool, and covered his face with his hands. "Can I help the people at the hospital having refused to receive my mother, because she was not raving mad?" asked Madeleine, in a low, peevish, and complaining voice. "What can I do to alter it? What is the use of your grumbling to me about my mother? And, if you fret ever so much about what neither you nor I can alter, what good will that do?" "None at all," rejoined the artisan, hastily brushing the large, bitter drops despair had driven to his eyes. "None whatever, you are right. But when everything goes against you, it is difficult to know what to do or say." "Gracious father!" cried Madeleine, "what an agony of thirst I am enduring! My lips are parched with the fever which is consuming me, and yet I shiver as though death were on me." "Wait one instant, and I will give you something to drink." So saying, Morel took the pitcher which stood beneath the roof, and, after having with difficulty broken the ice which covered the water, he filled a cup with the frozen liquid, and brought it to the bedside of his wife, who stretched forth her impatient hands to receive it. But, after a moment's reflection, he said, "No, no, I must not let you have it cold as this. In your present state of fever it would be dangerous." "So much the better, if it be dangerous. Quick, quick, give it me!" cried Madeleine, with bitterness. "It will the sooner end my misery and free you from such an encumbrance as I am. Then you will only have to look after mad folks and young children. There will be no sick nurse to take up your time." "Why do you say such hard words to me, Madeleine?" asked Morel, mournfully. "You know I do not deserve them." Pray do not add to my vexations, for I have scarcely strength or reason enough left to go on with my work. My head feels as though something were amiss with it, and I fear much my brain will give way. And then what would become of you all? 'Tis for you I speak. Were there only myself, I should trouble very little about to morrow. Thank heaven, the river flows for every one." "Poor Morel!" said Madeleine, deeply affected. "I was very wrong to speak so angrily to you, and to say I knew you would be glad to get rid of me. Pray forgive me, for indeed I did not mean any harm. For, after all, what use am I either to you or the children? For the last 16 months I have kept my bed. Gracious God! What I do suffer with thirst! For pity's sake, husband, give me something to moisten my burning lips." "You shall have it directly. I was trying to warm the cup between my hands." "How good you are! And yet I could say such wicked things to you." "My poor wife, you are ill and in pain, and that makes you impatient. Say anything you like to me, but pray never tell me again I wish to get rid of you." "But what good am I to any one? What good are our children? None whatever. On the contrary, they heap more toil upon you than you can bear." "True; yet you see that my love for them and you has endued me with strength and resolution to work frequently 24 hours out of the 24, till my body is bent and deformed by such incessant labour. Do you believe for one instant that I would thus toil and struggle on my own account? Oh, no! Life has no such charms for me, and if I were the only sufferer, I would quickly put an end to it." "And so would I," said Madeleine. "God knows, but for the children I should have said to you long ago, 'Morel, we have had more than enough to weary us of our lives. There is nothing left but to finish our misery by the help of a pan of charcoal.' But then I recollected the poor, dear, helpless children, and my heart would not let me leave them, alone and unprotected, to starve by themselves." "Well, then, you see, wife, that the children are, after all, of real good to us, since they prevent us giving way to despair, and serve as a motive for exerting ourselves," replied Morel, with ready ingenuity, yet perfect simplicity of tone and manner. "Now, then, take your drink, but only swallow a little at a time, for it is very cold still." "Oh, thank you, Morel!" cried Madeleine, snatching the cup, and drinking it eagerly. "Enough, enough! No more! You shall not have any more just now, Madeleine." "Gracious Heaven!" exclaimed Madeleine, giving back the cup. "How cold it seems now I have swallowed it! It has brought back those dreadful shiverings." "Alas!" ejaculated Morel, "I told you so! Ah, now you are quite ill again." "I have not strength even to tremble. I seem as though I were covered over with ice." Morel took off his jacket and laid it over his wife's feet, remaining quite naked down to his waist. The unhappy man did not possess a shirt. "But you will be frozen to death, Morel." "Never mind me. If I find it cold by and by, I will put my jacket on for a few minutes." "Poor fellow!" sighed Madeleine. "Ah, as you say, Heaven is not just. What have we done to be so wretched, while so many others—" "Every one has their troubles, some more, some less, the great as well as the small." "Yes, but great people know nothing of the gnawings of hunger, or the bitter pinching of the cold. Why, when I look on those diamonds, and remember that the smallest among them would place us and the poor children in ease and comfort, my heart sickens, and I ask myself why it is some should have so much and others nothing. And what good are these diamonds, after all, to their owners?"
"Why, if we were to go to the question of what half the luxuries of life are really good for, we might go a great way. For instance, what is the good of that grand gentleman Madame Pipelet calls the commandant having engaged and furnished the first floor of this house, when he seldom enters it? What use is it his having there good beds and warm covering to them, since he never sleeps in them?" "Very true. There is more furniture lying idle there than would supply 2 or 3 poor families like ours. And then Madame Pipelet lights a fire every day, to preserve the things from the damp. Only think of so much comfortable warmth being lost, while we and the children are almost frozen to death. But then, you will say, we are not articles of value. No, indeed, we are not. Oh, these rich folks, what hard hearts they have!"
"No harder than other people's, Madeleine. But then, you see, they do not know what misery or want are. They are born rich and happy, they live and die so. How, then, do you expect they can ever think such poor distressed beings exist in a world which to them is all happiness? No, I tell you they have no idea of such things as fellow creatures toiling beyond their strength for food, and perishing at last with hunger. How is it possible for them to imagine privation like ours? The greater their hunger, the greater enjoyment of their abundant meal. Is the weather severe or the cold intense, they call it a fine frost, a healthful, bracing season. If they walk out, they return to a glowing, cheerful fire, which the cold only makes them relish the more, so that they can scarcely be expected to sympathise with such as are said to suffer from cold and hunger, when those 2 things rather add to than diminish their pleasure.
Ah, poor folks are better than rich, since they can feel for each other, and are always ready and willing to assist each other as much as lies in their power. Look at that kind, good Mlle. Rigolette, who has so often sat up all night either with me or the children during our illness. Why, last night she took Jérôme and Pierre into her room to share her supper, and it was not much either she had for herself, only a cup of milk and some bread. At her age, all young people have good appetites, and she must have deprived herself to give to the children."
"Poor girl, she is indeed most kind. And why is she so? Because she knows what poverty is. As I said to you just now, if the rich only knew!"
"And then that nice looking lady who came, seeming so frightened all the while, to ask us if we wanted anything. Well, now she knows that we do want everything, will she ever come again, think you?"
"I dare say she will; for, spite of her uneasy and terrified looks, she seemed very good and kind."
"Oh, yes; if a person be but rich, they are always right in your opinion. One might almost suppose that rich folks are made of different materials to poor creatures like us."
"Stop, wife," said Morel, gently. "You are getting on too fast. I did not say that. On the contrary, I agree that rich people have as many faults as poor ones. All I mean is, that unfortunately they are not aware of the wretchedness of one half of the world. Agents in plenty are employed to hunt out poor wretches who have committed any crime, but there are no paid agents to find out half-starving families and honest artisans, worn out with toil and privations, who, driven to the last extremity of distress, are, for want of a little timely succour, led into sore temptation. It is quite right to punish evil doers, it would, perhaps, be better still to prevent ill deeds. A man may have striven hard to remain honest for 50 years, but want, misery, and utter destitution put bad thoughts in his head, and one rascal more is let loose on the world, whilst there are many who, if they had but known of his distressed condition. However, it is no use talking of that, the world is as it is. I am poor and wretched, and therefore I speak as I do. Were I rich, my talk would be of fête and happy days, and worldly engagements. And how do you find yourself now, wife?"
"Much the same. I seem to have lost all feeling in my limbs. But how you shiver! Here, take your jacket, and pray put it on. Blow out that candle, which is burning uselessly. See, it is nearly day."
And, true enough, a faint, glimmering light began to struggle through the snow with which the skylight was encumbered, and cast a dismal ray on the interior of this deplorable human abode, rendering its squalidness still more apparent. The shade of night had at least concealed a part of its horrors. "I shall wait now for the daylight before I go back to work," said the lapidary, seating himself beside his wife's paillasse, and leaning his forehead upon his 2 hands. After a short interval of silence, Madeleine said, When is Madame Mathieu to come for the stones you are at work upon?"
"This morning. I have only the side of one false diamond to polish."
"A false diamond? How is that? You who only make up real stones, whatever the people in the house may believe?"
"Don't you know? But I forgot, you were asleep the other day when Madame Mathieu came about them. Well, then, she brought me 10 false diamonds, Rhine crystals, to cut exactly to the same size and form as the like number of real diamonds she also brought. There, those are them mixed with the rubies on my table. I think I never saw more splendid stones, or of purer water, than those 10 diamonds, which must at least be worth 60,000 francs."
"And why did she wish them imitated?"
"Because a great lady to whom they belonged, a duchess, I think she said, had given directions to M. Baudoin, the jeweller, to dispose of her set of diamonds, and to make her one of false stones to replace it. Madame Mathieu, who matches stones for M. Baudoin, explained this to me when she gave me the real diamonds, in order that I might be quite sure to cut the false ones to precisely the same size and form. Madame Mathieu gave a similar job to 4 other lapidaries, for there are from 40 to 50 stones to cut; and I could not do them all, as they were required by this morning, because M. Baudoin must have time to set the false gems. Madame Mathieu says that grand ladies, very frequently unknown to anybody but the jeweller, sell their valuable diamonds, and replace them with Rhenish crystals."
"Why, don't you see, the mock stones look every bit as well as the real stones? Yet great ladies, who only use such things as ornaments, would never think of sacrificing one of their diamonds to relieve the distress of such unfortunate beings as we are."
"Come, come, wife, be more reasonable than this. Sorrow makes you unjust. Who do you think knows that such people as Morel and his family are in existence, still less that they are in want?"
"Oh, what a man you are, Morel! I really believe, if any one were to cut you in pieces, that while they were doing it, you would try to say thank you."
Morel compassionately shrugged his shoulders.
"And how much will Madame Mathieu owe you this morning?" asked Madeleine.
"Nothing, because you know I have already had an advance of 120 francs."
"Nothing? Why, our last sou went the day before yesterday. We have not a single farthing belonging to us."
"Alas, no!" cried Morel, with a dejected air.
"Well, then, what are we to do?"
"I know not."
"The baker refuses to let us have anything more on credit, will he?"
"No, and I was obliged yesterday to beg Madame Pipelet to lend me part of a loaf."
"Can we borrow anything more of Mother Burette?"
"She has already every article belonging to us in pledge. What have we to offer her to lend more money on our children?" asked Morel, with a smile of bitterness.
"But yourself, my mother, and all the children had but part of a loaf among you all yesterday. You cannot go on this way, you will be starved to death. It is all your fault that we are not on the books of the charitable institution this year."
"They will not admit any persons without they possess furniture or some such property; and you know we have nothing in the world. We are looked upon as though we lived in furnished apartments, and, consequently, ineligible. Just the same, if we try to get into any asylum, the children are required to have at least a blouse, while our poor things have only rags. Then, as to the charitable societies, one must go backwards and forwards 20 times before we should obtain relief. And then what would it be? Why, a loaf once a month, and half a pound of meat once a fortnight. Note 5. I should lose more time than it would be worth. Note 5. Such is the ordinary allowance made at charitable societies, in consequence of the vast number of applicants for relief."
"But still, what are we to do?"
"Perhaps the lady who came yesterday will not forget us."
"Perhaps not. But don't you think Madame Mathieu would lend us 4 or 5 francs, just to keep us from starving? You have worked for her upwards of 10 years, and surely she will not see an honest workman like you, burdened with a large and sickly family, perish for want of a little assistance like that."
"I do not think it is in her power to aid us. She did all in her power when she advanced me little by little 120 francs. That is a large sum for her. Because she buys diamonds, and has sometimes 50,000 francs in her reticule, she is not the much more rich for that. If she gains 100 francs a month, she is well content, for she has heavy expenses, 2 nieces to bring up, and 5 francs is as much to her as it would be to me. There are times when one does not possess that sum, you know; and being already so deeply in her debt, I could not ask her to take bread from her own mouth and that of her family to give it to me."
"This comes of working for mere agents in jewellery, instead of procuring employment from first-hand master jewellers. They are sometimes less particular. But you are such a poor, easy creature, you would almost let any one take the eyes out of your head. It is all your fault that——"
"My fault!" exclaimed the unhappy man, exasperated by this absurd reproach. "Was it or was it not your mother who occasioned all our misfortunes, by compelling me to make good the price of the diamond she lost? But for that, we should be beforehand with the world; we should receive the amount of my daily earnings; we should have the 1,100 francs in our possession we were obliged to draw out of the savings bank to put to the 1,300 francs lent us by M. Jacques Ferrand. May every curse light on him!"
"And you still persist in not asking him to help you? Certainly he is so stingy that I dare say he would do nothing for you; but then it is right to try. You cannot know without you do try."
"Ask him to help me!" cried Morel. "Ask him! I had rather be burnt before a slow fire. Hark ye, Madeleine, unless you wish to drive me mad, mention that man's name no more to me." As he uttered these words, the usually mild, resigned expression of the lapidary's countenance was exchanged for a look of gloomy energy, while a slight suffusion coloured the ordinarily pale features of the agitated man, as, rising abruptly from the pallet beside which he had been sitting, he began to pace the miserable apartment with hurried steps; and, spite of the deformed and attenuated appearance of poor Morel, his attitude and action bespoke the noblest, purest indignation. "I am not ill disposed towards any man," cried he, at length, pausing of a sudden, "and never, to my knowledge, harmed a human being; but I tell you, when I think of this notary, I wish him as much wretchedness as he has caused me." Then, pressing both hands to his forehead, he murmured, in a mournful tone, "Just God! What crime have I committed that a hard fate should deliver me and mine, tied hand and foot, into the power of such a hypocrite? Have his riches been given him only to worry, harass, and destroy those his bad passions lead him to persecute, injure, and corrupt?"
"That's right, that's right!" said Madeleine. "Go on abusing him. You will have done yourself a great deal of good, shall you not, when he puts you in prison, as he can do any day, for that promissory note of 1,300 francs on which he obtained judgment against you? He holds you fast as a bird at the end of a string. I hate this notary as badly as you do; but since we are so completely in his power, why you should—"
"Let him ruin and dishonour my child, I suppose?" burst from the pale lips of the lapidary, with violent and impatient energy.
"For heaven's sake, Morel, don't speak so loud! The children are awake, and will hear you."
"Pooh, pooh!" returned Morel, with bitter irony. "It will serve as a fine example for our 2 little girls. It will instruct them to expect that, one of these days, some villain or other like the notary may take a fancy to them, perhaps the same man; and then, I suppose, you would tell me, as now, to be careful how I offended him, since he had me in his power. You say if I displease him he can put me in prison. Now, tell the truth. You advise me, then, to leave my daughter at his mercy, do you not?" And then, passing from the extreme of rage at the idea of all the wickedness practised by the notary to tender recollections of his child, the unhappy man burst into a sort of convulsive weeping, mingled with deep and heavy sobs, for his kindly nature could not long sustain the tone of sarcastic indignation he had assumed. "Oh, my children!" cried he, with bitter grief. "My poor children! My good, my beautiful, too beautiful Louise! 'Tis from those rich gifts of nature all our troubles proceeded. Had you been less lovely, that man would never have pressed his money upon me. I am honest and hard working, and if the jeweller had given me time, I should never have been under the obligation to the old monster, of which he avails himself to seek to dishonour my child. I should not then have left her a single hour within his power, but I dare not remove her, I dare not. For am I not at his mercy? Oh, want! Oh, misery! What insults do they not make us endure?"
"But what can you do?" asked Madeleine. "You know he threatens Louise that if she quits him he will put you in prison directly."
"Oh, yes! He dares address her as though she were the very vilest of creatures."
"Well, you must not mind that, for she should leave the notary there is no doubt he would instantly throw you into prison, and then what would become of me, with these 5 helpless creatures and my mother? Suppose Louise did earn 20 francs a month in another place, do you think 7 persons can live on that?"
"And so that we may live, Louise is to be disgraced and left to ruin?"
"You always make things out worse than they are. It is true the notary makes offers of love to Louise; she has told us so repeatedly. But then you know what a good girl she is; she would never listen to him."
"She is good indeed, and so right-minded, active, and industrious. When seeing how badly we were off in consequence of your long illness, she insisted upon going to service that she might not be a burden to us, did I not say what it cost me to part with her? To think of my sweet Louise being subjected to all the harshness and humiliation of a servant's life! She who was naturally so proud that we used jokingly we could joke then to call her the princess, because she always said that, by dint of care and cleanliness, she would make our little home like a palace. Dear Louise! It would have been my greatest happiness to have kept her with me, though I had worked all day and all night too. And when I saw her blooming face, with her bright eyes glancing at me as she sat beside my work table, my labour always seemed lightened. And when she sung like a bird those little songs she knew I liked to hear, I used to fancy myself the happiest father alive. Poor dear Louise! So hard-working, yet always so gay and lively. Why, she could even manage your mother, and make her do whatever she wished. But I defy any one to resist her sweet words or winning smile. And how she watched over and waited upon you! What pains she would take to try and divert you from thinking of what you suffered! And how tenderly she looked after her little brothers and sisters, finding time for everything! Ah, with our Louise all our joy and happiness, all left us."
"Don't go on so, Morel. Don't remind me of all these things, or you will break my heart," cried Madeleine, weeping bitterly.
"And then, when I think that perhaps that old monster do you know, when that idea flashes across my brain my senses seem disturbed, and I have but one thought, that of first killing him, and then killing myself."
"What would become of all of us if he were to do so? Besides, I tell you again, you make things worse than they really are. I dare say the notary was only joking with Louise. He is such a pious man, and goes so regularly to mass every Sunday, and only keeps company with priests, folks say. Why, many people think that he is safer to place money with than the bank itself."
"Well, and what does all that prove? Merely that he is a rich hypocrite instead of a poor one. I know well enough what a good girl Louise is, but then she loves us so tenderly that it breaks her heart to see the want and wretchedness we are in. She knows well enough that if anything were to happen to me you would all perish with hunger; and by threatening to put me into prison he might work on the dear child's mind, like a villain as he is, and persuade her on our account. Oh, God, my brain burns! I feel as though I were going mad."
"But, Morel, if ever that were the case, the notary would be sure to make her a great number of fine presents or money, and, I am sure, she would not have kept them all to herself. She would certainly have brought part to us."
"Silence, woman! Let me hear no more such words escape your lips. Louise touch the wages of infamy! My good, my virtuous girl, accept such foul gifts! Oh, wife!"
"Not for herself, certainly; but to bring to us, perhaps she would."
"Madeleine!" exclaimed Morel, excited almost to frenzy, "again, I say, let me not hear such language from your lips; you make me shudder. Heaven only knows what you and the children also would become were I taken away, if such are your principles."
"Why, what harm did I say?"
"Oh, none."
"Then what makes you uneasy about Louise?"
The lapidary impatiently interrupted his wife by saying, "Because I have noticed for the last 3 months that, whenever Louise comes to see us, she seems embarrassed, and even confused. When I take her in my arms and embrace her, as I have been used to do from her birth, she blushes."
"Ah! That is with delight at seeing you, or from shame?"
"She seems sadder and more dejected, too, each visit she pays us."
"Because she finds our misery constantly increasing. Besides, when I spoke to her concerning the notary, she told me he had quite ceased his threats of putting you in prison."
"But did she tell you the price she has paid to induce him to lay aside his threats? She did not tell you that, I dare say, did she? Ah, a father's eye is not to be deceived; and her blushes and embarrassments, when giving me her usual kiss, make me dread I know not what. Why, would it not be an atrocious thing to say to a poor girl, whose bread depended on her employer's word, either sacrifice your virtuous principles and become what I would have you, or quit my house? And if any one should inquire of me respecting the character you have with me, I shall speak of you in such terms that no one will take you into their service. Well, then, how much worse is it to frighten a fond and affectionate child into surrendering her innocence, by threatening to put her father into prison if she refused, when the brute knows that upon the labour of that father a whole family depends? Surely the earth contains nothing more infamous, more fiend-like than such conduct."
"Ah," replied Madeleine, "and then only to think that with the value of one, only one of those diamonds now lying on your table, we might pay the notary all we owe him, and so take Louise out of his power, and keep her at home with us. Don't you see, husband?"
"What is the use of your repeating the same thing over and over again? You might just as well tell me that if I were rich I should not be poor," answered Morel, with sorrowful impatience; for such was the innate and almost constitutional honesty of this man, that it never once occurred to him that his weak–minded partner, bowed down and irritated by long suffering and want, could ever have conceived the idea of tempting him to a dishonourable appropriation of that which belonged to another. With a heavy sigh, the unfortunate man resigned himself to his hard fate. Thrice happy those parents who can retain their innocent children beneath the paternal roof, and defend them from the thousand snares laid to entrap their unsuspecting youth. But who is there to watch over the safety of the poor girl condemned at an early age to seek employment from home? Alas, no one! Directly she is capable of adding her mite to the family earnings, she leaves her dwelling at an early hour, and repairs to the manufactory where she may happen to be engaged. Meanwhile, both father and mother are too busily employed to have leisure to attend their daughters' comings or goings. "Our time is our stock in trade," cry they, "and bread is too dear to enable us to lay aside our work while we look after our children." And then there is an outcry raised as to the quantity of depraved females constantly to be met with, and of the impropriety of conduct among those of the lower orders, wholly forgetting that the parents have neither the means of keeping them at home, nor of watching over their morals when away from them. Thus mentally moralised Morel; then, speaking aloud, he added, "After all, our greatest privation is when forced to quit our parents, wives, or children. It is to the poor that family affection is most comforting and beneficial; yet directly our children grow up and are capable of becoming our dearest companions, we are forced to part with them." At this moment some one knocked loudly at the door. CHAPTER XII. Read by Celine Major.
Chapter 13, Part 1 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue, Chapter 13, Part 1, Judgment and Execution. The lapidary, much astonished, rose and opened the door. Two men entered the garret. One, tall, lanky, with an ill-favoured and pimply face, shaded by thick, grizzly whiskers, held in his hand a thick cane, loaded at the head. He wore a battered hat and a long-tailed and bespattered green coat, buttoned up close to his throat. Above the threadbare velvet collar was displayed his long neck, red and bald like that of a vulture. This man's name was Malicorne. The other was a shorter man, with a look as low-lived and red, fat, puffed features, dressed with a great effort at ridiculous splendour. Shiny buttons were in the folds of the front of his shirt, whose cleanliness was most suspicious, and a long chain of mosaic gold serpentined down a faded plaid waistcoat, which was seen beneath his seedy Chesterfield, of a yellowish grey colour. This gentleman's name was Bourdin. "How poverty-stricken this hole smells!" said Malicorne, pausing on the threshold. "Why, it does not scent of lavender water." "Confound it! But we have a lowish customer to deal with," responded Bourdin, with a gesture of disgust and contempt, and then advanced towards the artisan, who was looking at him with as much surprise as indignation. Through the door, left a little ajar, might be seen the villainous, watchful, and cunning face of the young scamp Tortillard, who, having followed these strangers unknown to them, was sneaking after, spying, and listening to them. "What do you want?" inquired the lapidary abruptly, disgusted at the coarseness of these fellows. "Jérôme Morel," said Bourdin. "I am he." "Working lapidary?" "Yes." "You are quite sure?" "Quite sure. But you are troublesome, so tell me at once your business, or leave the room." "Really, your politeness is remarkable. Much obliged. I say, Malicorne," said the man, turning to his comrade, "there's not so much fat to cut at here as there was at that 'ere Viscount de Saint Remy's." "I believe you; but when there is fat, why the door's kept shut in your face, as we found in the Rue du Chaillot. The bird had hopped the twig, and precious quick, too, while such vermin as these hold on to their cribs like a snail to his shell." "I believe you. Well, the stone jug just suits such individuals." "The sufferer creditor must be a good fellow, for it will cost him more than it's worth, but that's his lookout." "If," said Morel, angrily, "you were not drunk, as you seem to be, I should be angry with you. Leave this apartment instantly." "Ha, ha, ha! He's a fine fellow with his elegant curve," said Bourdin, making an insulting allusion to the contorted figure of the poor lapidary. "I say, Malicorne, he has cheek enough to call this an apartment, a hole in which I would not put my dog." "Oh, dear! Oh, dear!" exclaimed Madeleine, who had been so frightened that she could not say a word before. "Call for assistance; perhaps they are rogues. Take care of your diamonds." And, seeing these two ill-looking strangers come closer to his working bench, on which his precious stones were still lying, Morel, fearful of some evil intentions, ran towards the table and covered the jewels with his two hands. Tortillard, still on the watch, caught at Madeleine's words, observed the movement of the artisan, and said to himself, "Ha, ha, ha! So they said he was a lapidary of sham stones. If they were mock, he would not be afraid of being robbed. This is a good thing to know. So Mother Mathieu, who comes here so often, is a matcher of real stones, after all, and has real diamonds in her basket. This is a good thing to know, and I'll tell the Chouette," added Bras Rouge's brat. "If you do not leave this room, I will call in the guard," said Morel. The children, alarmed at this scene, began to cry, and the idiotic mother sat up in her bed. "If any one has a right to call for the guard, it is we, you Mr. Twistabout," said Bourdin. "And the guard would lend us a hand to carry you off to gaol if you resist," added Malicorne. "We have not the magistrate with us, it is true, but if you have any wish for his company, we'll find you one, just out of bed, hot and heavy. Bourdin will go and fetch him." "To prison, me?" exclaimed Morel, struck with dismay. "Yes, to Cliché." "To Clichy?" repeated the artisan, with an air of despair. "It seems a hardish pill," said Malicorne.
"Well, then, to the debtors' jail, if you like that better," said Bourdin.
"You what, indeed? Why, the notary Ah, mon Dieu!"
And the workman, pale as death, fell on his stool, unable to add another word. "We are bound bailiffs come to lay hold of you. Now are you fly?"
"Morel, it is the note of Louise's master. We are undone!" exclaimed Madeleine in a tone of agony.
"Hear the judgment!" said Malicorne, taking from his dirty and crammed pocketbook a stamped writ. After having skimmed over, according to custom, a part of this document in an unintelligible tone, he distinctly articulated the last words, which were, unfortunately, but too important to the artisan. "Judgment finally given. The tribunal condemns Jérôme Morel to pay to Pierre Petit-Jean, merchant, Note 6, by every available means, even to the arrest of body, the sum of 1,300 francs, with interest from the day of protest, and to pay all other and extra costs. Given and judged at Paris, 13 September, etc., etc."
Note 6. The cunning notary, unable to prosecute in his own name, had made the unfortunate Morel give a blank acceptance, and had filled up the note of hand with the name of a third party.
"And Louise, Louise!" cried Morel, almost distracted in his brain, and apparently unheeding the long preamble which had just been read. "Where is Louise, then? For doubtless she has quitted the notary, since he sends me to prison. My child, my Louise, what has become of you?" "Who the devil is Louise?" asked Bourdin. "Let him alone," replied Malicorne, brutally. "Don't you see the respectable old twaddler is not right in his nonsense box?" Then, approaching Morel, he added, "I say, my fine fellow, right about file, march on. Let us get out of here, will you, and have a little fresh air? You stink enough to poison a cat in this here hole."
"Morel!" shrieked Madeleine, wildly, "don't go! Kill those wretches! Oh, you coward, not to knock them down! What, are you going to let them take you away? Are you going to abandon us all?"
"Pray don't put yourself out of the way, ma'am," said Bourdin, with an ironical grin. "I've only just got to remark that if your good man lays his little finger on me, why, I'll make him remember it," continued he, swinging his loaded stick round and round. Entirely occupied with thoughts of Louise, Morel scarcely heard a word of what was passing. All at once an expression of bitter satisfaction passed over his countenance, as he said, "Louise has doubtless left the notary's house. Now I shall go to prison willingly." Then, casting a troubled look around him, he exclaimed, "But my wife, her mother, the children, who will provide for them? No one will trust me with stones to work at in prison, for it will be supposed my bad conduct has sent me there. Does this hard-hearted notary wish the destruction of myself and all my family also?" "Once, twice, old chap," said Bourdin. "Will you stop your gammon? You are enough to bore a man to death. Come, put on your things, and let us be off."
"Good gentlemen, kind gentlemen," cried Madeleine, from her sick bed, "pray forgive what I said just now. Surely you will not be so cruel as to take my husband away. What will become of me and my 5 poor children, and my old mother, who is an idiot? There she lies, you see her, poor old creature, huddled up on her mattress. She is quite out of her senses, my good gentleman, she is indeed quite mad." "La! What, that old bald-headed thing a woman? Well, hang me if that ain't enough to astonish a man." "I'll be hanged if it isn't, then!" cried the other bailiff, bursting into a hoarse laugh. "Why, I took it for something tied up in an old sack. Look! Her old head is shaved quite close. It seems as though she had got a white skull cap on." "Go, children, and kneel down, and beg of these good gentlemen not to take away your poor father, our only support," cried Madeleine, anxious by a last effort to touch the hearts of the bailiffs. But, spite of their mother's orders, the terrified children remained weeping on their miserable mattress. At the unusual noise which prevailed, added to the aspect of 2 strange men in the room, the poor idiot turned herself towards the wall, as though striving to hide from them, uttering all the time the most discordant cries and moans. Morel, meanwhile, appeared unconscious of all that was going on. This last stroke of fate had been so frightful and unexpected, and the consequences of his arrest were so dreadful, that his mind seemed almost unequal to understanding its reality. Worn out by all manner of privations, and exhausted by over toil, his strength utterly forsook him, and he remained seated on his stool, pale and haggard, and as though incapable of speech or motion, his head dropping on his breast, and his arms hanging listlessly by his side. "Deuce take me!" cried Malicorne, "if that old patterer is not going fast asleep! Why, I say, my chap, you seem to think nothing of keeping gentlemen like us waiting. Just remember, will you, our time is precious. You know this is not exactly a party of pleasure, so march, or I shall be obliged to make you." Suiting the action to the word, the man grasped the artisan by the shoulder and shook him roughly; which so alarmed the children that, unable to restrain their terror, the three little boys emerged from their paillasse, and, half naked as they were, came in an agony of tears to throw themselves at the feet of the bailiffs, holding up their clasped hands, and crying, in tones of touching earnestness, "Pray, pray, don't hurt our dear father!" At the sight of these poor, shivering, half clad infants, weeping with affright, and trembling with cold, Bourdin, spite of his natural callousness and long acquaintance with scenes of this sort, could not avoid a feeling almost resembling compassion from stealing over him, while his pitiless companion, brutally disengaging himself from the grasp of the small, weak creatures who were clinging to him, exclaimed, "Hands off, you young ragamuffins! A devilish fine trade ours would be, if we were to allow ourselves to be mauled about by a set of beggars' brats like you." As though the scene were not sufficiently distressing, a fearful addition was made to its horrors. The eldest of the little girls, who had remained in the paillasse with her sick sister, suddenly exclaimed, "Mother, mother, I don't know what's the matter with Adèle. She is so cold, and her eyes are fixed on my face, and yet she does not breathe." The poor little child, whose consumptive appearance we have before noticed, had expired gently and without a sigh, her looks fixed earnestly on the sister she so tenderly loved. No language can describe the cry which burst from the lips of the lapidary's wife at these words, which at once revealed the dreadful truth. It was one of those wild, despairing, convulsive shrieks, which seem to sever the very heartstrings of a mother. "My poor little sister looks as though she were dead," continued the child. "She frightens me, with her eyes fixed on me, and her face so cold." Saying which, in an agony of terror, she leaped from beside the corpse of the infant, and ran to shelter herself in her mother's arms, while the distracted parent, forgetting that her almost paralysed limbs were incapable of supporting her, made a violent effort to rise and go to the assistance of her child, whom she could not believe was actually past recovery. But her strength failed her, and with a deep sigh of despair she sunk upon the floor. The cry found an echo in the heart of Morel, and roused him from his stupor. He sprang with one bound to the paillasse, and withdrew from it the stiffened form of an infant 4 years old, dead and cold. Want and misery had accelerated its end, although its complaint, which had originated in the positive want of common necessaries, was beyond the reach of any human aid to remove. Its poor little limbs were already rigid with death. Morel, whose very hair seemed to stand on end with despair and terror, stood holding his dead child in his arms, motionlessly contemplating its thin features with a fixed blood-shot gaze, though no tear moistened his dry, burning eyeballs. "Morel, Morel, give Adèle to me!" cried the unhappy mother, extending her arms towards him. "She is not dead, it is not possible! Let me have her, and I shall be able to warm her in my arms." The curiosity of the idiot was excited by observing the pertinacity with which the bailiffs kept close to the lapidary, who would not part with the body of his child. She ceased her yells and cries, and, rising from her mattress, approached gently, protruded her hideous, senseless countenance over Morel's shoulder, staring in vacant wonder at the pale corpse of her grandchild, the features of the idiot retaining their usual expression of stupid sullenness. At the end of a few minutes she uttered a sort of horrible yawning noise, almost resembling the roar of a famished animal; then, hurrying back to her mattress, she threw herself upon it, exclaiming, "Hungry, hungry, hungry!"
"Well, gentlemen," said the poor half-crazed artisan, with haggard looks, "you see all that is left me of my poor child, my Adèle. We called her Adèle; she was so pretty she deserved a pretty name, and she was just 4 years old last night. Ay, and this morning even I kissed her, and she put her little arms about my neck and embraced me, oh, so fondly! And now, you see, gentlemen, perhaps you will tell me there is one mouth less to feed, and that I am lucky to get rid of one. You think so, don't you?" The unfortunate man's reason was fast giving way under the many shocks he had received. "Morel," cried Madeleine, "give me my child. I will have her." "To be sure," replied the lapidary; "that is only fair. Everybody ought to secure their own happiness." So saying, he led the child in its mother's arms, and, uttering a groan, such as comes only from a breaking heart, he covered his face with his hands; while Madeleine, almost as frenzied as her husband, placed the body of her child amid the straw of her wretched bed, watching it with frantic jealousy, while the other children, kneeling around her, filled the air with their wailings. The bailiffs, who had experienced a temporary feeling of compassion at the death of the child, soon fell back into their accustomed brutality. "I say, friend," said Malicorne to the lapidary, "your child is dead, and there's an end of it. I dare say you think it a misfortune, but then, you see, we are all mortal, and neither we nor you can bring it back to life. So come along with us; for, to tell you the truth, we're upon the scent of a spicy one we must nab to day; so don't delay us, that's a trump." But Morel heard not a word he said. Entirely preoccupied with his own sad thoughts, the bewildered man kept up a kind of wandering delivery of his own afflicting ideas. "My poor Adèle!" murmured he. "We must now see about laying you in the grave, and watching by her little corpse till the people come to carry it to its last home, to lay it in the ground. But how are we to do that without a coffin? And where shall we get one? Who will give me credit for one? Oh, a very small coffin will do, only for a little creature of 4 years of age. And we shall want no bearers. Oh, no, I can carry it under my arm. Ha, ha, ha!" added he, with a burst of frightful mirth. "What a good thing it is she did not live to be as old as Louise! I never could have persuaded anybody to trust me for a coffin large enough for a girl of 18 years of age." "I say, just look at that chap!" said Bourdin to Malicorne. "I'll be dashed if I don't think as he's going mad, like the old woman there. Only see how he rolls his eyes about! Enough to frighten one. Come, I say, let's make haste and be off. Only hark! How that idiot creature is a roaring for something to eat! Well, they are rum customers, from beginning to end." "We must get done with them as soon as we can, although the law only allows us 76 francs 75 centièmes for arresting this beggar, yet, in justice to ourselves, we must swell the cost to 240 or 250 francs. You know the sufferer, the creditor, pays us." "You mean advances the cash? Old Gaffer there will have to pay the piper, since he must dance to the music." "Well, by the time he has paid his creditor 2,500 francs for debt, interest, and expenses, etc., he'll find it pretty warm work." "A devilish sight more than we do our job up here. I'm a'most frostbitten," cried the bailiff, blowing the ends of his fingers. "Come, old fellow, make haste, will you? Just look sharp; you can snivel, you know, as we go along. Why, how the devil can we help it if your brat has kicked the bucket? These beggars always have such a lot of children if they have nothing else." "Yes, so they have," responded Malicorne. Then, slapping Morel on the shoulder, he called out, in a loud voice, "I tell you what it is, my friend, we're not going to be kept dawdling here all day. Our time is precious. So either out with this stumpy, or march off to prison, without any more bother."
"Ah, Mademoiselle Rigolette!" cried the weeping children, as they recognised the happy, healthful countenance of their young protectress and friend. "These wicked men are going to take our poor father away, and put him in prison. And Sister Adèle is just dead." "Dead!" cried the kind-hearted girl, her dark eyes filling with compassionating tears. "Poor little thing! But it cannot be true that your father is in danger of a prison." and, almost stupefied with surprise, she gazed alternately from the children to Morel, and from him to the bailiffs. "I say, my girl," said Bourdin, approaching Rigolette, "as you do seem to have the use of your senses, just make this good man here reason, will you? His child has just died. Well, that can't be helped now; but, you see, he is a keeping of us, because we're awaiting to take him to the debtors' prison, being sheriff's officers, duly sworn in and appointed. Tell him so." "Then it is true?" exclaimed the feeling girl. "True? I should say it was, and no mistake. Now, don't you see, while the mother is busy with the dead babby, and, bless you, she's got it there, hugging it up in bed, and won't part with it, she won't notice us. So I want the father to be off while she isn't thinking nothing about it." "Good God! Good God!" replied Rigolette, in deep distress. "What is to be done?" "Done? Why, pay the money or go to prison. There is nothing between them two ways. If you happen to have 2,000 or 3,000 francs by you, you can oblige with him, why, shell out, and we'll be off, and glad enough to be gone." "How can you," cried Rigolette, "be so barbarous as to make a jest of such distress as this?" "Well, then," rejoined the other man, "all joking apart, if you really do wish to be useful, try to prevent the woman from seeing us take her husband away. You will spare them both a very disagreeable 10 minutes." Coarse as was this counsel, it was not destitute of good sense; and Rigolette, feeling she could do nothing else, approached the bedside of Madeleine, who, distracted by her grief, appeared unconscious of the presence of Rigolette, as, gathering the children together, she knelt with them beside their afflicted mother. CHAPTer XIII. Read by Celine Major. Chapter XIII. Part II. Of the Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue. Chapter XIII. Part II. Meanwhile, Morel, upon recovering from his temporary wildness, had sunk into a state of deep and bitter reflections upon his present position, which, now that his mind saw things through a calmer medium, only increased the poignancy of his sufferings. Since the notary had proceeded to such extremities, any hope from his mercy was vain. He felt there was nothing left but to submit to his fate, and let the law take its course. "Are we ever to get off?" inquired Bourdin. "I tell you what, my man, if you are not for marching, we must make you, that's all." "I cannot leave these diamonds about in this manner. My wife is half distracted," cried Morel, pointing to the stones lying on his work table. "The person for whom I am polishing them will come to fetch them away either this morning or during the day. They are of considerable value." "Capital!" whispered Tortillard, who was still peeping in at the half closed door. "Capital! Capital! What will Mother Chouette say when I tell her this bit of luck?" "Only give me till to morrow," said Morel, beseechingly, "only till I can return these diamonds to my employer." "I tell you the thing can't be done, so let's have no more to say about it." "But it is impossible for me to leave diamonds of such value as these exposed, to be lost or even stolen in my absence." "Well, then, take them along with you. We have got a coach waiting below, for which you will have to pay when you settle the costs. We will go all together to your employer's house, and if you don't meet with him, why, then, you can deposit these jewels at the office of the prison, where they will be as safe as in the bank. Only look sharp, and let's be off before your wife and children perceive us." "Give me but till to morrow, only to bury my child," implored Morel, in a supplicating voice, half stifled by the heavy sobs he strove in vain to repress. "Nonsense, I tell you! Why, we have lost an hour here already." "Besides, it's dull work going to Baron's," chimed in Malicorne. "It would be too much for your feelings, perhaps." "Yes," said Morel, bitterly, "it is dull work to see what we would have given our lives to have laid in the cold earth. But as you are men, grant me that satisfaction." Then, looking up, and observing the nonchalant air with which his prayer was received, he added, "But no, persons of so much feeling as you are would fear to indulge me, lest I should find it a gloomy sight." "Well, then, at least grant me one word." "The deuce take your last words! Why, old chap, there seems no end to them. Come, put the steam on, make haste," said Malicorne, with brutal impatience, "or we shall lose t'other gent we're after." "When did you receive orders to arrest me?"
"Oh, why, judgment was signed 4 months ago; but it was only yesterday our officer got instructions to put it in execution." "Only yesterday? And why has it been delayed so long?" "How the devil should I know? Come, look about you, and put up your things." "Only yesterday? And during the whole day we saw nothing of Louise. Where can she be? Or what has become of her?" inquired the lapidary mentally, as he took from his table a small box filled with cotton, in which he placed his stones. "But never mind all that now. I shall have plenty of time to think about it when I am in prison." "Come, look sharp there a bit. Tie up your things to take with you, and put your clothes on, there's a fine fellow." "I have no clothes to tie up, and I have nothing whatever to take with me except these jewels, that I may deposit them at the office of the prison." "Well, then, dress yourself as quick as you can." "I have no other dress than what you now see me in." "I say, mate," cried Bourdin, "does he really mean to be seen in our company with such rags as those on?" "I fear, indeed, I shall shame such gentlemen as you are," said Morel, bitterly. "It don't much signify," replied Malicorne, "as nobody will see us in the coach."
"Father!" cried one of the children, "mother is calling for you."
"Listen to me," said Morel, addressing one of the men with hurried tones. "If one spark of human pity dwells within you, grant me one favour. I have not the courage to bid my wife and children farewell, it would break my heart; and if they see you take me away they will try to follow me. I wish to spare all this. Therefore, I beseech you to say, in a loud voice, that you will come again in 3 or 4 days, and pretend to go away. You can wait for me at the next landing place, and I will come to you in less than 5 minutes. That will spare all the misery of taking leave. I am quite sure it would be too much for me, and that I should become mad. I was not far off it a little while ago." "Not to be caught," answered Malicorne. "You want to do me? But I'm up to you. You mean to give us the slip, you old chouse." "God of heaven!" cried Morel, with a mixture of grief and indignation, "has it come to this?" "I don't think he means what you say," whispered Bourdin to his companion. "Let us do what he asks. We shall never get away unless we do. I'll stand outside the door. There is no other way of escaping from this garret. He cannot get away from us." "Very well; but what a dog hole! What a place for a man to care about leaving! Why, a prison would be a palace to it." Then, addressing Morel, he said, "Now, then, be quick, and we will wait for you on the next landing, so make up some pretence for our going." "Well," said Bourdin, in a loud voice, and bestowing a significant look at the unhappy artisan, "since things are as you say, and as you think you shall be able to pay us in a short time, why, we shall leave you for the present, and return in about 4 or 5 days; but you must not disappoint us then, remember." "Thank you, gentlemen. I have no doubt I shall be able to pay you then." The bailiffs then withdrew, while Tortillard, hearing the men talk of quitting the room, had hastened down stairs for fear of being detected listening.
"There, Madame Morel," said Rigolette, endeavouring to draw the wife of the lapidary from the state of gloomy abstraction into which she had fallen. "Do you hear that? The men have gone, and left your husband undisturbed." "Mother, mother!" exclaimed the children, joyfully, "they have not taken father away." "Morel, Morel!" murmured Madeleine, her brain quite turned, "take one of those diamonds, take the largest, and sell it. No one will know it, and then we shall be delivered from our misery. Poor little Adèle will get warm then, and come back to us." Taking advantage of the instant when no one was observing him, the lapidary profited by it to steal from the room. One of the men was waiting for him on the little landing place, which was also covered only by the roof. On this small spot opened the door of a garret, which adjoined the apartment occupied by the Morels, and in which M. Pipelet kept his dépôt of leather; and further, this little angular recess, in which a person could not stand upright, was dignified by the melancholy porter with the name of his melodramatic cabinet, because, by means of a hole between the lath and plaster, he frequently indulged in the luxury of woe by witnessing the many touching scenes occasioned by the distress of the wretched family who dwelt in the garret beyond it. This door had not escaped the lynx eye of the bailiff, who had, for a time, suspected his prisoner of intending either to escape or conceal himself by means of it. "Now, then, let us make a start of it!" cried he, beginning to descend the stairs as Morel emerged from the garret.
Rather a ragged recruit to march with," added he, beckoning the lapidary to follow him. "Only an instant, one single instant, for the love of God!" exclaimed Morel, as, kneeling down, he cast a last look on his wife and children through a chink in the door. Then, clasping his hands, he said, in a low, heart-broken voice, while bitter tears flowed down his haggard cheeks, "Adieu, my poor children, my wife! May Heaven preserve you all! Farewell! Farewell!" "Come, don't get preaching," said Bourdin, coarsely, "or your sermons may keep us here till night, which is what I can't stand, for I'm almost froze to death as it is. Ugh! What a kennel! What a hole!" Morel rose from his knees, and was about to follow the bailiff when the words, "Father! Father!" sounded up the staircase. "Louise!" exclaimed the lapidary, raising his hands towards heaven in a transport of gratitude. "Thank God, I shall be able to embrace you before I go."
"Heaven be praised, I am here in time!" cried the voice, as it rapidly approached, and quick light steps were distinguishable, swiftly ascending the stairs.
"Don't be uneasy, my dear," said a second voice, evidently proceeding from some individual considerably behind the first speaker, but whose thick puffing and laborious breathing announced the coming of one who did not find mounting to the top of the house so easy an affair as it seemed to her light-footed companion. The reader may, perhaps, have already guessed that the last comer was no other than Madame Pipelet, who, less agile than Louise, was compelled to advance at a much slower pace. "Louise! Is it indeed you, my own, my good Louise?" said Morel, still weeping. "But how pale you look! For mercy's sake, my child, what is the matter?"
"Nothing, father, nothing, I assure you," said Louise, in much agitation; "but I have run so fast. See, I have brought the money."
"What?"
"You are free."
"You knew, then, that "
"Oh, yes. Here, sir, you will find it quite right," said the poor girl, placing the rouleau of gold in the hands of Malicorne.
"But this money, Louise, how did you become possessed of it?"
"I will tell you all about it by and by. Pray do not be uneasy. Let us go and comfort my mother. Come, father."
"No, not just this minute," cried Morel, remembering that, as yet, Louise was entirely ignorant of the death of her little sister. "Wait an instant. I have something to say to you first. But about this money." "All right," said Malicorne, as, having finished counting the gold, he put it in his pocket, "precisely 1,300 francs. And is that all you have got for me, my pretty dear?"
"I thought, father," said Louise, struck with alarm and surprise at the man's question, "that you only owed 1,300 francs."
"Nor do I," replied Morel. "Precisely so," answered the bailiff. "The original debt is 1,300 francs. Well, that is all right now, and we may put settled against that. But then, you see, there are the costs, caption, etc., amounting to 1,140 francs, still to be paid."
"Gracious heavens!" cried Louise. "I thought 1,300 francs would pay everything. But, sir, we will make up the money, and bring it to you very soon. Take this for the present; it is a good sum. Take it as paid on account. It will go towards the debt, at least, won't it, father?"
"Very well. Then all you have to do is to bring the required sum to the prison, and then, and not till then, your father, if he is your father, will be set at liberty. Come, master, we must start, or we shall never get there."
"Do you really mean to take him away?"
"Do I? Don't I? Just look here. I am ready to give you a memorandum of having received so much on account; and whenever you bring the rest, you shall have a receipt in full, and your father along with it. There, now, that's a handsome offer, ain't it?"
"Mercy, mercy!" supplicated Louise.
"Phew!" cried the man. "Here's a scene over again. My stars, I hope this one isn't a going mad, too, for the whole family seems uncommon queer about the head. Well, I declare I never see anything like it. It is enough to set a man's perspiring in the midst of winter." And here the bailiff burst into a loud, coarse laugh at his own brutal wit.
"Oh, my poor dear father!" exclaimed Louise, almost distractedly, "when I had hoped to have saved you."
"No, no!" cried the lapidary, in a tone of utter despair, and stamping his foot in wild desperation. "Hope nothing for me. God has forgotten me, and heaven has ceased to be just to a wretch like me." "Calm yourself, my worthy friend," said a rich, manly voice. There is always a kind Providence that watches over and preserves good and honest men like you." At the same instant Rodolph appeared at the door of the small recess we have spoken of, from whence he had been an invisible spectator of much that we have related. He was pale and extremely agitated. At this sudden apparition the bailiff drew back with surprise, while Morel and his daughter gazed at the stranger with bewildered wonder. Taking from his waistcoat pocket a quantity of folded bank notes, Rodolph selected 3, and, presenting them to Malicorne, he said, "Here are 2,500 francs. Give this young woman back the money you have just received from her." Still more and more astonished at this singular interference, the man half hesitated to take the notes, and, when he had received them, he eyed them with the utmost suspicion, turning and twisting them about in every direction. At length, satisfied both as to their reality and genuineness, he finally deposited them in his pocket-book. But, as his surprise and alarm began to subside, so did his natural coarseness of idea return, and, eyeing Rodolph from head to foot with an impertinent stare, he exclaimed, "The notes are right enough; but pray who and what are you that go about with such sums? I should just wish to know whose it is, and how you came by it." Rodolph was very plainly dressed, and his appearance by no means improved by the dust and dirt his clothes had gathered during his stay in M. Pipelet's cabinet of melodrama. "I desired you to give back the gold you received just now from this young person," replied Rodolph, in a severe and authoritative tone. "You desired me? And who the devil are you to give your orders?" answered the man, approaching Rodolph in a threatening manner. "Give back the gold! Give it back, I say!" said the prince, grasping the wrist of Malicorne so tightly that the unhappy bailiff winced beneath his iron clutch. "I say," bawled he, "hands off, will you? Curse me if I don't think you're old Nick himself. I am sure your fingers are cased with iron." "Then return the money. Why, you despicable wretch, do you want to be paid twice over? Now return the gold and begone, or, if you utter one insolent word, I'll fling you over the banisters." "Well, don't kick up such a row; there's the girl's money," said Malicorne, giving back to Louise the rouleau he had received. "But mind what you are about, my Sparky, and don't think to ill use me because you happen to be the strongest." "That's right," said Bourdin, ensconcing himself behind his taller associate. "And who are you, I should like to know, who give yourself such airs?" "Who is he? Why, my lodger, my king of lodgers, you ill-looking, half-starved, hungry hounds, you ill-taught, dirty fellows!" exclaimed Madame Pipelet, who, puffing and panting for breath, had at last reached the landing where they stood. Her head, as usual, adorned with her Brutus wig, which, during the heat and bustle she had experienced in ascending the stairs, had got pushed somewhat awry, while in her hand she bore an earthen stewpan, filled with smoking hot broth, which she was charitably conveying to the Morels. "What the devil does this old hedgehog want?" cried Bourdin. "If you dare make any of your saucy speeches about me," returned Madame Pipelet, "I'll make you feel my nails, ay, and my teeth, too, if you provoke me. And if you don't mend your manners, my lodger, my king of lodgers, will pitch you over the banisters, and I will sweep you out into the street, as I would a heap of rubbish." "This old beldam will bring the whole house about our ears," said Bourdin to Malicorne. "We've touched the blunt, our expenses and all; so I say off is a good word." "Here, take your property," said the latter, flinging a bundle of law papers at the feet of Morel. "Pick them up, and deliver them decently. You have been paid as a respectable officer would have been, act like one," cried Rodolph, seizing the bailiff vigorously with one hand, while with the other he pointed to the papers. Fully convinced by this second powerful grip how useless any attempt at resistance would prove, the bailiff stooped down, and, mechanically picking up the papers, gave them to Morel, who, scarcely venturing to credit his senses, believed himself under the influence of a delightful dream. "Well, young chap," grumbled out Malicorne, "although you have got a fist as strong as a drayman's, mind you, if ever you fall into my clutches, I'll make you smart for this." So saying, he doubled his fist at Rodolph, and then scrambled down the stairs, taking 4 or 5 at a time, followed by his companion, who kept looking behind him with indescribable terror; while Madame Pipelet, burning to avenge the insults offered to her king of lodgers, looked at her steeping stewpan with an air of inspiration, and heroically exclaimed, "The debts of the Morels are paid!
Henceforward they will have plenty of food, and can do without my messes. Look out there below!"
So saying, she stooped over the banisters, and poured the contents of her stewpan down the backs and shoulders of the two bailiffs, who had just reached the first floor landing.
"There goes!"
screamed out the delighted portress.
"Capital! Ha, ha, ha! There they are! 2 regular sops in the pan! Well, I do enjoy this!"
"What the devil is this?" exclaimed Malicorne, thoroughly soaked with the hot, greasy liquid.
"I say, I wish you would mind what you are about there, you old figure of fun!" "Alfred!" bawled Madame Pipelet,
in a tone sharp and shrill enough to have split the tympanum of a deaf man.
"Alfred, my old darling, have at 'em! They wanted to behave ill to your Stasie (Anastasie). The nasty fellows have been taking liberties, quite violent. Knock them down with your broom. And call the oyster woman, and the man at the wine vaults to help you. Get out, you! Get out! Ch ch ch! Thieves! Thieves! Robbers! Ch! Brrr! Hoo hoo hoo! Knock them down! That's right, old dear! Pay them off! Break their bones! Serve them out! Boom boom boom!"
And, by way of conclusion to this concatenation of discordant noises, accompanied by a constant succession of stamping and kicking of feet, Madame Pipelet, carried away by the excitement of the moment, flung her earthen stewpan to the bottom of the staircase, which, breaking into 1,000 pieces at the very instant that the two bailiffs, terrified by the yells and noises from overhead, were precipitately descending the stairs with hasty strides, added not a little to their terror.
"Ah, ha, ha!"
cried Anastasie, bursting into loud fits of laughter.
"Now be off with you! I think you have had enough."
Then, crossing her arms, she stood, like a triumphant Amazon, rejoicing in the victory she had achieved. While Madame Pipelet was thus venting her rage upon the bailiffs, Morel had thrown himself in heartfelt gratitude at the feet of Rodolph. "Ah, sir," exclaimed he, when at last words came to his assistance, "you have saved a whole family. To whom do we owe this unhoped-for assistance?" "To the God who watches over and protects all honest men, as your immortal Béranger says." Note. The following are some curious particulars relative to bodily restraint, as cited in the Pauvre Jacques, a journal published under the patronage of the Society for the Furtherance and Protection of Christianity. Prison Committee, Comité des Prisons. A protest and intimation of bodily restraint are generally carried out by sheriff's officers, and charged by law; the first 4 francs 35 centièmes, the second 4 francs 70 centièmes. For these, however, the officers usually demand, for the former, 10 francs 40 centièmes, for the second 16 francs 40 centièmes; thus illegally claiming from the unfortunate victims of law 26 francs 80 centièmes for that which is fixed by that very law at 9 francs 50 centièmes. For an arrest the legal charge is, including stamp and registering, 3 francs 50 centièmes; coach hire, 5 francs; for arrest and entry in the prison books, 60 francs 25 centièmes; office dues, 8 francs; total, 76 francs 75 centièmes. A bill of the usual scale ordinarily charged by sheriff's officers, now lying before us, shows that these allowances by law are magnified by the extortion of the officers into a sum of about 240 francs, instead of the 76 francs they are alone entitled to claim. The same journal says, "Sheriff's officer has been to our office, requesting us to correct an article which appeared in one of our numbers, headed, 'A woman hung.' I did not hang the woman," observed he, angrily. We did not assert that he did, but, to prevent any further misapprehension, content ourselves with reprinting the paragraph in question. A few days ago a sheriff's officer, named , went to the Rue de la Lune to arrest a carpenter, who dwelt there. The man, perceiving him from the street, rushed hastily into his house, exclaiming, 'I am a ruined man! The officers are here to arrest me!' His wife, at these words, hastened to secure the door; while the carpenter ran to a room on the top of the house to conceal himself. The officer, finding admittance refused, went and fetched a magistrate and a blacksmith. The door was forced, and, on proceeding up stairs,
The woman was found hanging in her own bedchamber. The officer did not allow himself to be diverted from the pursuit by the sight of the corpse. He continued his search, and at length discovered the husband in his hiding place. "I arrest you!" cried the bailiff. "I have no money," replied the man. "Then you must go to prison." "Let me at least bid my wife adieu." "It is not worth while waiting for that; your wife is dead. She has hung herself. Now, Monsieur , adds the journal we have quoted. What have you to say to that? You see, we have merely copied your own statement upon oath, in which you have detailed all these frightful circumstances with horrible minuteness. The same journal also cites 200 or 300 similar facts, of which the following may serve as a specimen. The expenses upon a note of hand for 300 francs have been run up by the sheriff's officers to 964 francs. The debtor, therefore, who is a mere artisan, with a family of 5 children, has been detained in prison for the last 7 months. The author of this work had a double reason for borrowing thus largely from the pages of the Pauvre Jacques. In the first place, to show that the horrors of the last chapter are far below reality in their painful details, and secondly, to prove that, if only viewed in a philanthropic light, the allowing such a state of things to go on, namely, the exorbitant and illegal fees both demanded and exacted by certain public functionaries, frequently acts as a preventive to the exercise of benevolence and paralyses the hand of charity. Thus, were a small capital of 1,000 francs collected among kind-hearted individuals, 3 or 4 honest, though unfortunate, artisans might be released from a prison and restored to their families, by employing the above-named sum in paying the debts of such as were incarcerated for amounts varying from 250 to 300 francs. But when the original debt is increased threefold by the excessive and illegal expenses, even the most charitable recede from the good work of delivering a fellow creature, from the impression that 2/3 of their well-intentioned bounty would only go into the pockets of pampered sheriff's officers and their satellites. And yet no class of unfortunate beings stand more in need of aid and charitable assistance than the unfortunate class we have just been speaking of. Chapter 13, Part 2. Read by Celine Major. Chapter 14, Part 1 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène, Chapter 14, Part 1. Rigolette. Louise, the daughter of the lapidary, was possessed of more than ordinary loveliness of countenance, a fine, tall, graceful person, uniting, by the strict regularity of her faultless features and elegance of her figure, the classic beauty of Juno, with the lightness and elegance assigned to the statue of the hunting Diana. Spite of the injury her complexion had received from exposure to weather, and the redness of her well-shaped hands and arms, occasioned by household labour, despite even the humble dress she wore, the whole appearance of Louise Morel was stamped with that indescribable air of grace and superiority nature sometimes is pleased to bestow upon the lowly born in preference to the descendant of high lineage. We shall not attempt to paint the joy, the heartfelt gratitude of this family, so wondrously preserved from so severe a calamity. Even the recent death of the little girl was forgotten during the first burst of happiness. Rodolph alone found leisure to remark the extreme paleness and utter abstraction of Louise, whose first ecstasy at finding her father free passed away, apparently plunged into a deep and painful reverie. Anxious to relieve the mind of Morel of any apprehensions for the future, and also to explain a liberality which might have raised suspicions as to the character he chose to assume, Rodolph drew the lapidary to the further end of the staircase, leaving to Rigolette the task of acquainting Louise with the death of her little sister, and said to him: "Did not a young lady come to visit you and your family on the morning of the day before yesterday?" "Yes, and appeared much grieved to see the distress we were in." "Then you must thank her, not me." "Can it be possible, sir? That young lady " "Is your benefactress. I frequently wait upon her from our warehouse, when I hired an apartment here. I learned from the porteress all the particulars of your case, and the painful situation you were placed in. Relying on this lady's well-known kindness and benevolence, I hastened to acquaint her with all I had heard respecting you, and the day before yesterday she came herself, in order to be fully aware of the extent of your misery. The distress she witnessed deeply affected her; but as it might have been brought about by misconduct, she desired me to take upon myself the task of inquiring into every circumstance relative to your past and present condition with as little delay as possible, being desirous of regulating her benevolent aid by the good or bad accounts she might receive of your honesty and good conduct. Kind, excellent lady, well might I say, as you observed just now to Madeline, if the rich did but know, was not that it? Is it possible that you are acquainted with the name of my wife? Who could have told you that?" "My worthy friend," said Rodolph, interrupting Morel, "I have been concealed in the little garret adjoining your attic since 6 o'clock this morning." "Have you indeed, sir?" "Yes, my honest fellow, I have, and from my hiding place heard all that passed among you." "Oh, sir! But why did you do so?" "I could not have employed more satisfactory means of getting at your real character and sentiments, and I was desirous of seeing and hearing all you did or said without your being aware of my presence. The porter had me acquainted with this small retreat, which he offered to me for a wood closet. This morning I asked his permission to visit it, and remained there more than an hour, during which time I had ample proof that a more upright, noble mind did not exist, and that the courageous resignation with which you bore your heavy trials was above all praise." "Nay, indeed, sir, I do not merit such words as these. I was born honest, I hope, and it comes natural to me to act as I have done." "I am quite sure of that; therefore I do not laud your conduct, I appreciate it. Just as I was about to quit my hiding place, to relieve you of the presence of the bailiffs, I heard the voice of your daughter, and I meant to have allowed her the happiness of saving you. Unhappily, the rapacity of the men deprived poor Louise of the full completion of her pious task. I then made my appearance. Fortunately, I yesterday received several sums that were due to me, so I was enabled to advance the money for your benefactress, and to pay off your unfortunate debt. But your distress has been so great, so unmerited, and so nobly sustained, that the well-deserved interest you have excited shall not stop here, and I take upon myself, in the name of your preserving angel, to promise you henceforward calmness, peace, and happiness for yourself and family." "Can it be possible? But, at least, sir, let me beseech you to tell me the name of this angel of goodness, this heavenly preserver, that it may dwell in our hearts and on our lips. By what name shall we bless her in our prayers? Think of her and speak of her as the angel she is. Ah, you were right in saying just now that both rich and poor had their sorrows. And is this dear lady then unhappy? Who is free from care and suffering in this world of trial? But I see no cause for concealing you from the name of your protectress. The lady, then, is named. Remembering that Madame Pipelet was aware of Madame d'Harville's having, at her first coming to the house, inquired for the commandant, and fearing her indiscreet mention of the circumstance, Rodolph resumed, after a short pause: "I will venture to tell you this lady's name, upon one condition." "Pray go on, sir." "That you never mention it again to any one, mind, I say to any person whatever." "I solemnly promise you never to let it pass my lips, but may I not hope to be permitted to thank this friend of the unfortunate?" "I will let Madame d'Harville know your wish, but I scarcely think she will consent to it." "Then this generous lady is called—" "The Marquise d'Harville." "Never will that name be forgotten by me. Henceforward it will be to me as that of my patron saint, the object of my grateful worship. Oh, when I remember that, thanks to her, my wife, children, all are saved! Saved! No, not all. My little Adèle has gone from us. We shall see her sweet face no more. But still, I know we must have parted with her sooner or later. The dear child's doom was long since decreed." Here the poor lapidary wiped away the tears which filled his eyes at the recollection of his lost darling. "As for the last duties that have now to be performed for your poor child," said Rodolph, "if you will be guided by me, this is how we will arrange it. I have not yet begun to occupy my chamber. It is large, airy, and convenient; there is already one bed in it; and I will give orders to add all that may be requisite for the accommodation of yourself and family, until Madame d'Harville is enabled to find an eligible abode for you. The remains of your little daughter can be left in your attic, where, until the period of interment, They can be properly watched and guarded by a priest with all requisite attention. I will request M. Pipelet to take upon himself every necessary arrangement for the mournful office of laying the poor babe in its peaceful grave." "Nay, sir, but indeed I cannot allow you to be turned out of your apartment. Now that we are so happily freed from our misery, and that I have no longer the dread of being dragged to prison, our poor garret will seem to me like a palace, more especially if my Louise remains to watch over the family as she used to do. Your daughter shall never again quit you. You said a while ago that the first desire of your heart was to have Louise always with you. Well, then, as a reward for your past sufferings, I promise you she shall never leave you more." "Oh, sir, this is too much! It cannot be reality. It seems as though I were dreaming some happy dream. I fear I have never been as religious as I ought. I have, in fact, known no other religion than that of honour. But such a reverse, such a change from wretchedness to joy, would make even an atheist believe, if not in priests, at least in a gracious, interposing, and preserving Providence." "And if," said Rodolph, sadly, "a father's sorrow for the loss of his child can be assuaged by promises of rewards or recompense, I would say that the heavenly hand which takes one child from you gives you back the other." "True, most true. And henceforward our dear Louise will be with us to help us to forget our poor Adèle." "Then you will accept the offer of my chamber, will you not? Or else how shall we be able to arrange for the mournful duties to the poor infant? Think of your wife, whose head is already in so weak a state. It will never do to allow her to remain with so afflicting a spectacle constantly before her eyes." "What goodness!" exclaimed the lapidary, "thus to remember all, to think of all! Oh, you are indeed a friend! May Heaven bless and recompense you! Come, you must reserve your thanks for the excellent lady you term your protecting angel. 'Tis her goodness inspires me with a desire to imitate her benevolence and charity. I feel assured I am but speaking as she would speak, were she here, and that all I do she will fully approve. So now, then, it is arranged you will occupy my room. But, just tell me, this Jacques Ferrand—" The forehead of Morel became clouded over at the mention of this name. "I suppose," continued Rodolph, "there is no doubt as to his being the same Jacques Ferrand who practises as a notary in the Rue du Sentier?" "None whatever, sir," answered Morel. "But do you know him?" Then, assailed afresh by his fears for Louise, the lapidary continued: "Since you overheard all our conversation, tell me, sir, tell me, do you not think I have just cause to hate this man, as I do? For who knows but my daughter, my Louise—" The unhappy artisan could not proceed; he groaned with anguish, and concealed his face with his hands. Rodolph easily divined the nature of his apprehensions. "The very step taken by the notary ought to reassure your mind," said he, "as there can be no doubt he was instigated by revenge for your daughter's rejection of his improper advances to proceed to the hostile measures adopted. However, I have every reason to believe he is a very bad and dangerous man; and if my suspicions respecting him are realised," said Rodolph, after a few moments' silence, "then rely on Providence to punish him. If the just vengeance of the Almighty seems occasionally to slumber, it awakens sooner or later." "He is both rich and hypocritical!" cried the lapidary. "At the moment of your deepest despair, a guardian angel appeared to save you from ruin; so, at the moment when least expected, will an inexorable avenger call upon the notary to atone for his past crimes, if he be guilty." At this moment Rigolette came out of the miserable garret belonging to Morel. The kind-hearted girl had evidently been shedding tears, and was trying to dry her eyes before she descended the stairs. Directly Rodolph perceived her, he exclaimed: "Tell me, my good neighbour, will it not be much better for M. Morel and his family to occupy my chamber while they are waiting till his benefactress, whose agent I am, shall have found a comfortable residence for him?" Rigolette surveyed Rodolph with an air of unfeigned surprise. "Really," cried she, at length, "are you in earnest in making so kind and considerate an offer?" "Quite so, on one condition, which depends on yourself." "Oh, all that it is in my power!" "You see,
I had some rather difficult accounts to arrange for my employer, which are wanted as early as possible. Indeed, I expect they will be sent for almost directly. My papers are in my room. Now, would you be neighbourly enough to let me bring my work into your apartment, and just spare a little corner of your table? I should not disturb your work the least in the world, and then the whole of the Morel family, by the assistance of Madame Pipelet and her husband, may at once be established in my apartment."
"Certainly I will, and with great pleasure. Neighbours should always be ready to help and oblige each other. I am sure, after all you have done for poor M. Morel, you have set a good example. So I shall be very glad to give you all the assistance in my power, monsieur."
"No, no, don't call me monsieur; say, my dear friend, or neighbour, whichever you prefer. Unless you lay aside all ceremony, I shall not have courage to intrude myself and papers into your room," said Rodolph, smiling.
"Well, pray don't let that be any hindrance. Then, if you like, I'll call you neighbour, because you know you are so." "Father, father!" said one of Morel's little boys, coming out of the garret, "mother is calling for you. Make haste, father, pray do." The lapidary hastily followed the child back to his chamber.
"Now then, neighbour," said Rodolph to Rigolette, "you must do me one more service."
"With all my heart, if it lies in my power to do so."
"I feel quite sure you are a clever manager and housekeeper. Now we must go to work at once to provide the Morels with comfortable clothing, and such matters as may be essential to their accommodation in my apartment, which at present merely contains my slender stock of bachelor's furniture sent in yesterday. Beds, bedding, and a great quantity of requisites will be needed for so many persons; and I want you to assist me in procuring them all the comforts I wish them to have with as little delay as possible."
Rigolette reflected a moment, and then replied: "You shall have all this before 2 hours have passed. Good clothes, nicely made, warm and comfortable, good white linen for all the family, 2 small beds for the children, 1 for the grandmother, and, in fact, all that is required. But I can tell you, all this will cost a great, great deal of money."
"Diable! And how much?"
"Oh, at least, the very least, 500 or 600 francs."
"For everything?"
"Yes, you see it is a great sum of money," said Rigolette,
opening her eyes very wide, and shaking her head. "But we could procure all this?"
"Within 2 hours."
"My little neighbour, you must be a fairy."
"Oh, no, it is easy enough. The Temple is but 2 steps from here, and you will get there everything you require."
"The Temple?"
"Yes, the Temple."
"What place is that?"
"What, neighbour, don't you know the Temple?"
"No, neighbour."
"Yet it is the place where such persons as you and I fit themselves out in furniture and clothes, when they are economical. It is much cheaper than any other place, and the things are all so good."
"Really?"
"I think so. Well, now, I suppose, how much did you pay for your greatcoat?"
"I cannot say precisely."
"What, neighbour, not know how much you gave for your greatcoat?"
"I will tell you in confidence, neighbour," said Rodolph, smiling, "that I owe for it, so you see, I cannot exactly say."
"Oh, neighbour, neighbour, you do not appear to me to be very orderly in your habits."
"Alas, neighbour, I fear not."
"I must cure you of that, if you desire that we should continue friends; and I see already that we shall be, for you seem so kind. You will not be sorry to have me for a neighbour, I can see. You will assist me, and I shall assist you. We are neighbours, and that's why. I shall look after your linen; you will give me your help in cleaning my room. I am up very early in the morning, and will call you, that you may not be late in going to your work. I will knock against the wainscot until you say to me, 'Good morning, neighbour.'"
"That's agreed. You shall awaken me, you shall take charge of my linen, and I will clean out your room."
"Certainly; and when you have anything to buy, you must go to the Temple; for see now, for example, your greatcoat must have cost you 80 francs, I have no doubt. Well, you might have bought one just as good at the Temple for 30 francs."
"Really? That is marvellous! And so you think that for 400 or 500 francs these poor Morels
will be completely set up, and very comfortable for a long while."
"Neighbour, an idea comes across me."
"Well, what is this idea?"
"Do you understand all about household affairs?"
Yes, I should think so," said Rigolette, with a slight affectation of manner.
"Take my arm, then, and let us go to the Temple and buy all these things for the Morels. Won't that be a good way?"
"Oh, how capital! Poor souls! But then the money?"
"I have it."
"What, 500 francs?"
"The benefactor of the Morels has given me carte blanche, and she will spare nothing to see these poor people restored to comfort. Is there any place where we can buy better supplies than at the Temple?"
"Certainly not; you will not find better things anywhere. And then there is everything, and already there, little frocks for children, and gowns for the mother."
"Well, then, neighbour, let us go at once to the Temple."
"Ah, mon Dieu! But—"
"What?"
"Nothing. Only, you see, my time is everything to me, and I am already a little behindhand, through coming here to watch over poor Madame Morel; and you must know that an hour in one way, and an hour in another, that by little and little makes whole days. Well, a day is 30 sous, and, whether we gain something or nothing, we must live. But, bah, never mind! I will make up for that at night; and then, d'ye see, parties of pleasure are very rare, and I call this one. It will seem to me that I am rich, 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 and that it is with my own money that I shall buy all these things for the Morels. So come along, neighbour. I will throw on my shawl and cap, and then I am ready."
"Suppose, whilst you are doing this, I bring my papers to your apartment?"
"Willingly, and then you will see my room," said Rigolette, with pride; "for it is all tidy, which will convince you how early I am in the morning, and that, if you are idle and a sluggard, so much the worse for you, for I shall be a troublesome neighbour."
CHAPTER XV. Read by Celine Major. CHAPTER XIV. Part II of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue. Chapter XIV. Part II. So saying, light as a bird, Rigolette descended the staircase, followed by Rodolph, who went into his own room to brush off the dust which had settled on him in M. Pipelet's garret. We will hereafter disclose how it was that Rodolph was not informed of the carrying off of Fleur de Marie from the farm at Bouqueval, and why he had not visited the Morels the day after his conversation with Madame d'Harville. Rodolph, furnished, by way of saving appearances, with a thick roll of papers, entered Rigolette's chamber. Rigolette was nearly the same age as Goualeuse, her old prison acquaintance. There was between these two young girls the same difference that there is between laughter and tears, between joyous lightheartedness and melancholy dejection, between the wildest thoughtlessness and a dark and constant reflection on a future, between a delicate, refined, elevated, poetic nature, exquisitely sensitive, and incurably wounded by remorse, and a gay, lively, happy, good, and compassionate nature. Rigolette had no sorrows but those derived from the woes of others, and with these she sympathised with all her might, devoting herself, body and soul, to any suffering fellow creature. But, her back turned on them, to use a common expression, she thought no more about them. She often checked her bursts of laughter by a flood of tears, and then checked her tears by renewing her laughter. Like a real Parisian, Rigolette preferred excitement to calm, and motion to repose. The loud and echoing harmony of the orchestra at the Fête of the Chartreuse, or the Colissée, to the soft murmurs of the breeze, waters, and leaves; the bustling disturbance of the thoroughfares of Paris, to the silent solitude of the fields; the brilliancy of fireworks, the flaring of the grand finale, the uproar of the maroons and Roman candles, to the serenity of a lovely night, starlight, clear and still. Alas, yes! The dear, good little girl actually preferred the pavement of the streets of the capital to the fresh moss of the shaded paths perfumed with violets, the dust of the boulevards to the waving of the ears of corn mingled with the scarlet of the wild poppies and the azure of the bluebells. Rigolette only left her chamber on Sundays, and each morning to provide her prescribed allowance of chickweed, bread, milk, and millet for herself and her two birds, as Madame Pipelet observed. But she lived in Paris for Paris, and would have been wretched to have resided anywhere but in the capital. A few words as to the personal appearance of the grisette, and we will then introduce Rodolph into the chamber of his neighbour.
Rigolette was scarcely 18 years of age, of middle height, rather small than large, but so gracefully formed, so admirably proportioned, so delightfully filled out, so entirely in accordance with her step, which was light and easy, that she seemed perfect of her kind. The movement of her finely formed feet, always encased in well made boots of black cloth, with a rather thick sole, reminded you of the quick, pretty, and cautious tread of the quail or wagtail. She did not seem to walk, but to pass over the pavement as if she were gliding over the surface. This step, so peculiar to grisettes, at once nimble, attractive, and as if somewhat alarmed, may doubtless be attributed to three causes: their desire to be thought pretty, their fear of being mistaken for what they are not, and to the desire they always have not to lose a minute in their peregrinations. Rodolph had not seen Rigolette but by the dim light of Morel's garret, or on the landing place, equally obscure, and he was therefore really struck by the bright and fresh countenance of the young girl when he softly entered her apartment, which was lighted up by two large windows. He remained motionless for a moment, in admiration of the striking picture before his eyes. Standing in front of a glass placed over her mantelpiece, Rigolette was tying under her chin the ribbons of a small cap of bordered tulle, ornamented with a light trimming of cherry-coloured riband. The cap, which fitted tightly, was placed at the back of her head, and thus revealed two large and thick bandeaux of glossy hair, shining like jet, and falling very low in front. Her eyebrows, fine and well defined, seemed as if traced in ink, and curved above two large, black, piercing, and intelligent eyes. Her firm and velvety cheeks were suffused with the rosy hue of health, fresh to the eye, fresh to the touch, like a ripe peach covered with the dew of dawn. Her small, upturned, attractive, and saucy nose would have been a fortune to any Lisette or Marton. Her mouth, which was rather large, had rosy and moist lips, small, white, close, and pearly teeth, and was laughter-loving and sportive. Three charming dimples, which gave a characteristic grace to her features, were placed, two in her cheeks, and the other in her chin, close to a beauty spot, a small ebony speck, which was most killingly situated at the corner of her mouth. Between a worked collar, which fell very low, and the border of the little cap, gathered in by a cherry-coloured riband, was seen a forest of beautiful hair, so accurately twisted and turned up that their roots were seen as clearly and as black as if they had been painted on the ivory of that lovely neck. A plum-coloured merino gown, with a plain back and close sleeves, made skilfully by Rigolette, covered a figure so small and slender that the young girl never wore a corset, for economy's sake. An ease and unusual freedom in the smallest action of the shoulders and body, which resembled the facile undulations of a cat's motions, evinced this fact. Imagine a gown fitting tightly to a form rounded and polished as marble, and we must agree that Rigolette could easily dispense with this accessory to the toilet of which we have spoken. The tie of a small apron of dark green levantine formed a girdle around her waist which might have been spanned by the 10 fingers. Believing herself to be alone, for Rodolph still remained at the door, motionless and unperceived, the grisette, having smoothed down her bandeau with her small hand, white and delicately clean, put her small foot on a chair and stooped to tie the lace of her boot. This attitude developed to Rodolph a portion of a cotton stocking, white as snow, and a well-formed ankle and leg. After the detail we have given of this toilet, we may guess that Rigolette had selected her prettiest cap and best apron to do honour to her neighbour on their excursion to the Temple. She found the pretended tradesman's clerk very much to her taste. His face, at once kind, bold, and animated, pleased her greatly. And then he had been so kind to the Morels by giving up his room to them, so that, thanks to this proof of goodness, and perhaps also to his good looks, Rodolph had unwittingly advanced into the confidence of the grisette with giant strides. She, according to her ideas, founded on the compelled intimacy and reciprocal obligation which neighbourhood invites, thought herself very fortunate in having such a neighbour as Rodolph to succeed to the travelling clerk, Cabrion, and François Germain; for she was beginning to find that the next room had remained very long empty, and was afraid that she would never again see it occupied in an agreeable manner. Rodolph took advantage of his invisibility to cast a curious eye around him, and he found the apartment even beyond the praises which Madame Pipelet had bestowed on the extreme cleanliness of the humble home of Rigolette. Nothing could be more lively or better arranged than this apartment. A gray paper, with green garlands, covered the walls. The floor, painted of a red colour, shone like a looking-glass. A small earthenware stone was placed in the chimney, where was piled up, very symmetrically, a small store of wood, cut so short, so thin, that, without exaggeration, each piece might have been compared to a very large match. On the stone mantelpiece, painted gray marble, there were, for ornaments, 2 pots of common flowers, covered with green moss. A small case of boxwood contained a silver watch instead of a pendule. On one side was a brass candlestick, shining like gold, and having in it a small piece of wax light; and on the other side, no less resplendently, one of those lamps formed by a cylinder and a brass reflector, supported by a bar of steel, and having a base of lead. A tolerably large square glass, in a black wood frame, was over the mantelpiece. Curtains of gray and green Persian cloth, with a woollen fringed border, cut and worked by Rigolette, and hung in light rings of black iron, decorated the windows; and the bed was covered with a counterpane of the same make and material. 2 closets, with glass doors, and painted white, were in each side of the recess, enclosing, no doubt, household utensils, the portable stove, the fountain, brooms, etc.; for none of these things spoiled the neat appearance of the chamber. A chest of drawers of well veined and shining walnut tree, 4 chairs of the same wood, a large table for ironing and working, covered with one of those green woollen coverings which we sometimes see in a peasant's cottage, a straw armchair, with a stool to match, the constant seat of the workwoman, such was the unpretending furniture. There was, too, in one of the window seats, a cage with 2 canary birds, the faithful companions of Rigolette. By one of those notable ideas which occur to the poor, this cage was placed in the middle of a large wooden chest, about a foot deep, placed on a table. This chest, which Rigolette called her bird's garden, was filled with mould, covered with moss during the winter, and in spring the young girl sowed grass seeds and planted flowers there. Rodolph examined the place with interest, and entered fully into the cheerful disposition of the grisette. He pictured to himself this solitude, enlivened by the song of the birds and of Rigolette herself. In summer, no doubt, she worked at the open window, half veiled by a verdant curtain of sweet peas, roses, nasturtiums, and blue and white convolvulus. In winter she warmed herself near her small stove by the soft light of her lamp. Rodolph was thus reflecting, when, looking mechanically at the door, he saw there a large bolt, a bolt which would not have been out of place on the door of a prison. This bolt made him reflect. It might have 2 meanings, 2 very distinct uses: to close the door on the lover within, to close the door on the lover without. Rodolph was aroused from his reflections by Rigolette, who, turning her head, saw him, and, without changing her attitude, said to him: "What, neighbour, are you there?" Then the well-formed ankle instantly disappeared beneath the ample skirt of the plum-coloured gown, and Rigolette added, "Ah, Mr. Cunning?" "I was here admiring in silence." "Admiring what, neighbour?" "This pretty little room, for, neighbour, you are lodged like a queen." "Why, you must know that it is my enjoyment. I never go out, and so I can do no less than make my home comfortable." "But really I never saw anything half so nice. What pretty curtains, and the drawers as handsome as mahogany! You must have spent a great deal of money here." "Oh, don't mention it! If I had, of my own, 425 francs when I left the prison, and almost all has been spent." "When you left the prison? You?" "Yes, but it is a very long story. Of course, you do not suppose that I was in prison for anything wrong?" "Of course not. But how was it?" "After the cholera, I was quite alone in the world. I was then, I think, 10 years of age." "But who had taken care of you till then?" "Ah, some excellent people; but they died of the cholera." Here Rigolette's large eyes became moistened. "They had sold the little they possessed to pay their small debts, and I remained without having any one who would take care of me. Not knowing what to do, I went to the guard house opposite to our house, and said to the sentinel, 'Sir, my relations are dead, and I do not know where to go. What must I do?' Then the officer came, and he took me to the commissary, who put me in prison as a vagabond, and I did not go out until I was 16 years old." "But your relations?" "I do not know who my father was, and I was 6 years old when I lost my mother, who had recovered me from the Enfants Trouvés, Foundling Hospital, where she had been compelled at first to place me. The kind people of whom I spoke to you lived in our house; they had no children, and, seeing me an orphan, they took care of me." "And what were they? What was their business or pursuit?"
Papa Crétu, so I always called him, was a house painter, and his wife worked at her needle."
"Then they were pretty well off?"
"Oh, like other people in their station, though they were not married; but they called each other husband and wife. They had their ups and downs, to day plenty, if there was work to be had, to morrow short commons, if there was none; but that did not prevent the couple from being content and always cheerful."
At this remembrance Rigolette's face brightened up.
"There was not such a household in the quarter; always merry, always singing, and, with it all, as good as they could be. What they had any one was welcome to share. Mamma Crétu was a plump body, about 30 years old, as neat as a penny, as active as an eel, as merry as a lark. Her husband was a regular good-tempered fellow, with a large nose, a wide mouth, and always a paper cap on his head, and such a funny face! Oh, so funny! You could not look at him without laughing. When he came home after work, he did nothing but sing, and make faces, and gambol like a child. He used to dance me on his knees, and play with me like a child of my own age, and his wife spoiled me, as if I had been a blessing to her. They both required only one thing from me, and that was to be in a good humour; and in that I never thwarted them, thank Heaven! So they called me Rigolette. And the name has stuck to me. As to mirth, they set me the example, for I never saw them sorrowful. If ever there was a word, it was the wife who said to her husband, 'Crétu, you silly fellow, do be quiet, you make me laugh too much.' Then he said to her, 'Hold your foolish tongue, Ramonette.' I don't know why he called her Ramonette. 'Do be still, you really make my sides ache, you are so funny.' And then I laughed to see them laugh, and in this way I was brought up, and in this way they formed my disposition, and I hope I have profited by it."
The French verb rigoler is to be merry. E.T. Most assuredly you have, neighbour. So there never were any disputes between them?
Never, oh, never! Sunday, Monday, and sometimes on Tuesday, they made holiday, or kept wedding day, as they called it, and always took me with them. Papa Crétu was an excellent workman, and when he chose to work, he could earn what he pleased, and so could his wife, too. If they had got enough to do for Sunday and Monday, and live on pretty comfortably, they were perfectly satisfied. If after this they were on short allowance for a time, they didn't mind it. I remember when we had only bread and water, Papa Crétu took from his library."
"He had a library, then?"
"Oh, he used to call a little box so, in which he put his collection of new songs, for he bought all the new ones, and knew them every one. When, then, there was nothing but bread in the house, he used to take an old cookery book from his library, and say to us, 'Well, now, let us see, what shall we eat to day? This or that?' And then he used to read out a long list of good things. Each of us chose a dish, and then Papa Crétu took an empty saucepan, and, with the funniest airs and gestures in the world, pretended to put into the saucepan all the ingredients requisite for making a capital stew; and then he used to pretend to pour it all out into a dish, also empty, which he placed on the table, with still the same drollery, which almost split our sides. Then he took up his book again, and, whilst he was reading to us, for instance, the recipe of a good fricassee of chicken, which we had chosen, and which made our mouths water, we ate our bread, all laughing like so many mad people."
"And in this happy household, were there any debts to trouble them?"
"None whatever. So long as the money lasted, they ate, drank, and made merry, and when it was all gone, they lived upon make believe, as before."
"And did they never think of the future?"
"Oh, yes, they thought of it, of course; but what is the future to such as we? Present and future are like Sunday and Monday; the one we spend gaily and happily outside the barriers, the other is got over in the faubourg."
"And why, since this couple seems so well assorted, did they never marry?"
"A friend of theirs once put that very question in my presence."
"Well, and what did they say?"
"Oh," said they, "if ever we have any children, it may all very well to marry, but as far as we are concerned, we do very well as we are.
And why should we make an obligation of that which we now perform willingly? Besides, getting married costs money, and we have none to spare in unnecessary expenses. But, my goodness," added Rigolette, "how I am running on! But really, when once I begin to talk of these kind people, who were so good to me, I never know when to leave off. Here, neighbour, will you give me my shawl off the bed, and put it nicely over my shoulders, then pin it underneath the collar of my habit shirt with this large pin, and then we will set off, for it will take us some time to select the different things you wish to buy for the poor Morels." Rodolph readily obeyed the directions of Rigolette. First he took from the bed a large plaid shawl, which he placed with all imaginable care on the well formed shoulders of Rigolette. "That will do, neighbour. Now lift up my collar, and press the shawl and dress together; then stick in the pin; but pray try not to prick me with it." The prince executed the orders given with zealous accuracy, then observed, smilingly, to the grisette: "Ah, Mlle. Rigolette, I should not like to be your femme de chambre; there is danger in it." "Yes, I know," answered Rigolette, gaily; "there is great danger for me of having a pin run in by your awkwardness. But now," added she, after they had left the room, and carefully locked the door after them, "take my key; it is so large, I always expect it will burst my pocket; it is as large as a pistol." And here the light hearted girl laughed merrily at her own conceit. Rodolph, accordingly, took charge, that is the prescribed form of speech, of an enormous key, which might well have figured in one of those allegorical devices in which the vanquished are represented as humbly offering the keys of their lost cities to the conquerors. Although Rodolph believed himself too much changed by years to run any risk of being recognised by Polidori, he still deemed it prudent to draw up the collar of his paletot as he passed by the door of the apartments belonging to the quack Bradamanti. "Neighbour," said Rigolette, "don't forget to tell M. Pipelet that you are about to send in some things which are to be carried at once up to your chamber." "You are right, my good friend; let us step into the porter's lodge for an instant." M. Pipelet, with his everlasting bell shaped hat on his head, dressed as usual, in the accustomed green coat, and seated before a table covered with scraps of leather and fragments of boots and shoes, was occupied in fixing a new sole on a boot, his whole look and manner impressed with the same deeply meditative air which characterised his usual proceedings. Anastasie was just then absent from the lodge. "Well, M. Pipelet," said Rigolette, "I hope you will be pleased to hear the good news. Thanks to my good neighbour here, the poor Morels have got out of trouble. La! When one thinks of that poor man being taken off to prison! Oh, those bailiffs have no hearts!" "Nor manners either, mademoiselle," rejoined M. Pipelet, in an angry tone, wrathfully brandishing the boot then in progress of repair, and into which he had inserted his left hand and arm. "No, I have no hesitation in declaring, in the face of all mankind, that they are a set of mannerless scoundrels. Why, taking advantage of the darkness of our stairs, they actually carried their indecent violence so far as to lay their audacious fingers upon the waist of my wife. When I first heard the cries of her insulted modesty, I could not restrain myself, and, spite of all efforts to restrain myself, I yielded to the natural impetuosity of my disposition. Yes, I will frankly confess, my first impulse was to remain perfectly motionless." "But I suppose afterwards," said Rigolette, who had much ado to preserve a serious air, "afterwards, M. Pipelet, you pursued them, and bestowed the punishment they so well deserved?" "I'll tell you, mademoiselle," answered Pipelet, deliberately, "when these shameless ruffians passed before my lodge, my blood boiled, and I could not prevent myself from hastily covering my face, that I might not be shocked by the sight of these luxurious malefactors. But afterwards I ceased to be astonished; for well I knew I might expect some sight or sound to shock my senses. Full well I was prepared for some direful misfortune ere the day had passed, for I dreamed last night of Cabrion." Rigolette smiled, while the heavy groans which broke from the oppressed mind of the porter were mingled with blows of his hammer, as he vigorously applied it to the sole of the boot he was mending. "You wisely chose the wisest part, my dear M. Pipelet, that of despising offences, and holding it beneath you to revenge them. But try to forget these ill-conducted bailiffs, and oblige me by doing me a great favour." "Man is born to help his fellow man," drawled out Pipelet, in a melancholy and sententious tone. "And he is still further called upon so to do when a good and worthy gentleman, moreover, a lodger in one's house, is concerned." "What I have to request of you is to carry up to my apartments for me several things I am about to send in, and which are for the Morels." "Make yourself easy upon that point, monsieur," replied Pipelet. "I will faithfully perform your wishes." "And afterwards," said Rodolph, mournfully, "you must obtain a priest to watch by a little girl the Morels have lost in the night. Go and give the requisite notification of the death, and bespeak a suitable funeral." "Make your mind easy, monsieur," replied Pipelet, more gravely even than before. "Directly my wife returns, I will go to the mayor, the church, and the traiteur's, to the church, for the soul of the dead; to the traiteur's, for the body of the living," added M. Pipelet, philosophically and poetically. "Consider it done in both cases, my good sir, consider it done." At the entrance to the alley, Rodolph and Rigolette encountered Anastasie returning from market with a huge basket of provisions. "That's right, that's right!" cried the porteress, looking at the pair with a knowing and significant air. "There you go, arm in arm already. To be sure, look and love, love and look. Young people will be young people, no doubt on't. Me and Alfred was just the same. Who ever heard of a pretty girl without a beau? So go along, my dears, and make yourselves happy while you can." Then, after gazing after them some minutes, the old woman disappeared in the depths of the alley, crying out, "Alfred, my old darling, don't worry yourself, Stassy's coming to bring you something nice, oh, so nice!"
End of Chapter 14, Part 2. End of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 2, by Eugène Sue. Read by Celine Major.